From Nation States to Network States Chapter 5 Why now? Why now? After almost 400 years of the Westphalian nation-state, why do we think the status quo could change? First, the status quo. What is the modern nation-state, anyway? What is a nation, for that matter? How was state formation enabled long ago by technological innovations like mapmaking and print capitalism? When did the political events transpire that led to the rise of the nation-state? And what were the historical alternatives? Then, the change. What are the contemporary catalysts, the technological and political developments that promise to alter centuries of practice? What are the concepts, charts, calculations, and citations that suggest big changes are in the offing? And what might a network state even look like? On nation states, you may think you know what a nation state is, but you probably haven't given it much thought. Poke on the abstraction a bit, and fun ensues. You start realizing how different the nation is from the state, how tricky it is to determine who qualifies as a nation, how confusing our modern terminology around this topic is, and how many other modes of human organization represent potential competitors to the nation state. That exploration opens the door to the network state. In the process, you'll encounter all those philosophers people vaguely recall from school. You know, Locke and Rousseau, Plato and Aristotle, the subjects of countless boring book reports. Many of them make a showing in this chapter. But their presence here is different from the typical dry as dust college lecture, because the network state makes political science and applied science more like political technology. You are listening with intent to repeat. That is, just like cryptocurrencies gave people other than the Fed chair a reason to learn about everything from seigniorage to demurrage. Crypto countries give people other than the founding fathers the ability to put political theory into political practice. But only if you understand that theory, so let's dive in. What is a nation-state? The most obvious definition is that a nation-state is a geographic region of the world ruled by a group of humans we call a government. It's what we talk about when we refer to countries like the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. It's a flag-labeled region on a political map of the globe. Britannica provides a more precise definition. Namely that a nation-state is a territorially bounded sovereign polity, that is ruled in the name of a community of citizens that identify themselves as a nation. And that latter bit is key. Because a nation-state is not just a government that controls a territory. It's supposed to be a government that represents a distinct people, a nation. What is the nation-state system? There's an excellent passage from Joshua Keating in his book Invisible Countries on the peculiarity of the nation-state system. He analogizes the system to a selective club with the following 8 rules. Rule 1. A country is a territory defined by borders mutually agreed upon by all countries. Rule 2. A country must have a state that controls, or at least seeks to control, the legitimate use of force within its territory, and a population of citizens. Rule 3. Every spot on the Earth's landmass must be occupied by a country. Rule 4. Every person on the planet must be a citizen of at least one country. Rule 5. On paper, all countries have the same legal standing. Tuvalu has just as much right to its countryhood as China, Somalia just as much as Switzerland. Even if they are politically and economically highly unequal. Rule 6. Consent of the people within each country is preferred, but not required. Tyranny or de facto anarchy within a country is not grounds for loss of club membership. Rule 7. Under some circumstances, one or more countries may invade or occupy another country, but not eliminate its countryhood or redraw its borders. Rule 8. The currently existing set of countries and the borders between them should be left in place whenever possible, that is, the club prefers not to admit new members. Keating goes on to note that the rules of this club are backed by the institutions of the UN and the military force of the US, and that the agreement of billions of people through their governments on the current world order is what preserves cartographic stasis. Note that even if one thinks of the UN as ineffectual, it's a Schelling point for the system. Nothing else has as much legitimacy as many backlinks. Assumptions of the nation-state system. We can describe the assumptions of the nation-state system in a different lens. One that makes it easier to understand the differences between this system and the network state system we will introduce in the following pages. Physical first. The physical map of the world is primary. Composition. In theory, a nation-state is composed of a single nation, the people, and an administrative entity, the state. In practice, some nation-states are really multinational empires, while some nations are stateless nations. No terra incognita. The modern nation-state system takes for granted that there is no terra incognita, that the map of the physical world is fully known, such that it can be subdivided. No terra nullis. The system also takes for granted that there's no terra nullis, no unclaimed land. With few exceptions, every piece of land on the surface of the earth is spoken for by one and only one state. Much of the ocean is likewise split up this way, aside from international waters. Top-down division of land. The fully visible map is carved into geographical regions called states, with borders precisely demarcated by latitudes and longitudes. One state per citizen. People are typically citizens of just one state. Changing citizenship is infrequent, and most citizens are governed by the same state as their parents. The primary method of citizenship is still jus sanguinis, by birth. Legitimacy from physical control and electoral choice. A nation-state's legitimacy comes from a few sources. First, the state needs to be good enough at violence to actually control the territory it claims. Second, but really secondarily, the state is supposedly legitimized by the support of their underlying nation and the demonstrated respect for universal human rights. It's unfortunately a secondary point because any group that is in de facto control of territory for long enough eventually gets recognized. Ideally, a legitimate state reflects the will of its people while also respecting the rights of the individual, giving voice to the masses and the minority alike. Centralized administration. The administrators of the state, frequently an executive and a legislature, write laws on paper to specify what is mandatory and forbidden. These laws are typically interpreted by a judiciary and enforced by men with guns. And in the nation-state system, every piece of land is administered by exactly one state, regardless of who is on it. Domestic monopoly of violence. Each state keeps order within its borders through a police force. Citizens who defy the law are subject to increasing levels of violence until they comply, as per Grand Theft Auto. International sovereignty via military. In principle, states aren't supposed to interfere with the domestic affairs of other states. In practice, a state only maintains sovereignty if it is competent enough in defending against domestic and foreign rivals alike, via its police, intelligence agencies, and military. Diplomatic recognition via bilateral and multilateral fora. States may sign bilateral agreements with each other, or they may be recognized by multilateral fora like the UN, the World Trade Organization, WTO, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the G20. Diplomatic recognition is a matter of both politics and paperwork, and the lack of recognition can isolate a state and/or its citizens. Treaties manage cooperation and constraint. A set of cross-border compacts attempt to govern interstate interaction and limit abuses, promising things like human rights and freedom of movement, declarations that are frequently flouted. Pax Americana. Finally, while it was not always so, the guarantor of the current nation-state system is the USA, which is where the UN is headquartered, and which purports to provide global leadership and champion the rules-based international order. All other states must hope that this guarantor of the rules-based order doesn't decide to invade, survey, sanction, strafe, or otherwise destabilize them. These cover the 6 essential parts of the state: borders, population, central government, international sovereignty, diplomatic recognition, and the domestic monopoly on violence. The nation-state as a term. Understanding the term nation-state requires us to distinguish the nation, a group of people with common descent, history, culture, or language, from the state, the government. They are not the same. Even though nation is often conflated with state, the term nation-state has 2 words for a reason. The first word, nation, has the same etymological root as natality. It once denoted a group of people with shared ancestry. The second word, state, refers to the entity that governs these people, that commands the police and the military, and that holds the monopoly of violence over the geographic area that the nation inhabits. In a sense, the nation and the state are as different as labor and management in a factory. The former are the masses and the latter are the elite. The textbook nation-state is something like Japan, in which a single group with shared ancestry and culture, the Japanese, occupies a clearly delineated territory, the islands of Japan, and is ruled by a clear sovereign, the Japanese government, which is representative of the people in some sense, originally via the divine, contemporaneously via the diet. Micronations and multinations. This gives us a new perspective on why micronations like Sealand don't work. They start backwards, from the territory and the government, rather than working forwards from a people and their culture. The latter process is how nation-states historically emerged. A state was set up by a nation to govern it, not vice versa, though then that self-same state often began the process of assimilating others into its founding nation, so it was a bidirectional process. Bidirectionality notwithstanding, the egg of the nation precedes the chicken of the state. From this perspective, a better term than micronation is really microstate, because it's not a micronation unless it represents a small group of aligned people. A single person self-proclaiming a government is just a tiny state. As the saying goes, you and what army? Without a nation, there is no army, and no legitimacy. 151. On the other side of the spectrum is an empire, or multination. The Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Soviet Empire contained many nations and ethnic groups. This vantage point allows us to rectify more vocabulary. The concept of a multinational corporation, for example, is something of a misnomer. The right term is a multi-state corporation, which operates across polities, as opposed to a multinational state, which manages the affairs of many different ethnic groups within its boundaries. Zero nation, one nation, n nations in between. Zero nation microstates and n nation empires are one nation states. Governments that are set up to manage the affairs of a single ethnic group in a defined territory. However, while this kind of terminology is not exactly deprecated, it's a bit old-fashioned. It's not how we tend to talk about nation-states in the current year. First, today we often discuss multi-ethnic states, multinations, like the USA, which are really more like the empires of yore than a classical monoethnic nation-state. Second, many contend that physical borders don't matter in the age of the Internet. Third, modern discourse focuses to a much greater extent on proposition nations, where shared ideas are the organizing principle rather than shared inheritance. Fourth, and most importantly, conflict between ethnic groups within states can result in civil war, mass deportation, totalitarian brainwashing, ethnic cleansing, forced conversion, and cultural destruction. the kind of process that recently resulted in the formations of East Timor and South Sudan. Later, we'll talk about how network states address these issues, but these are the understandable reasons why the distinction between the nation and the state has fallen out of favor. Scholars don't want to inadvertently encourage separatism or irredentism or worse. Lest people think it's not a real nation-state unless the political entity, the state, represents all the members of a single ethnicity, the nation, in all the lands around the world where they preponderate. Or at least, they don't want to do so domestically. Because the average American is a bit schizophrenic when it comes to terminology like this. He can easily understand the desire of, say, the Ukrainian people to break free of the Russian Empire. Or for the Tibetan nation to have their own government separate from the Chinese state, or for the Persian people to distinguish themselves from the theocracy of Iran. But the same person is typically more skeptical that Britain should have exited the European Union, let alone that the Texan nation should have its own sovereign state. The cynical might say that national aspirations get airtime in proportion to the national interest. The more cynical might say that even the term national interest is yet another misnomer. Because it's more like that state's interest given that the American state rules more than one nation. This, however, leads us to the key question of what exactly constitutes a nation. What is a nation? This question was once all-important. What groups are significant enough to be called nations, candidates for a state of their own? It will soon be all-important again, as important as what is a currency, and for similar reasons, because Bitcoin, Web3, the metaverse, remote work, mobile, and the internet allow people to exit legacy arrangements and form new groups more easily than at any time in the recent past. But which of these groups should be considered a nation? A definitional approach. Let's start with Oxford's definition by way of their free service Lexico. A large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a particular country or territory. From that definition, we can extract the following properties. A large body of people has to be of a substantial size, 10 to 100k plus, united. Members see themselves as being part of the same group. Common descent, shared genetics, have intermarried more with each other than people outside the nation. Or, history, shared past, have lived near each other for some time. Or culture, shared dress, food, mannerisms, religion, and/or customs. Or language, shared spoken and/or written tongue. Inhabiting a particular territory, found in a specific region of the globe. Each of these pieces can be poked at. How large is large? How do we measure whether a group of people is united? How localized to a particular territory does a nation have to be, or can it be nomadic? And why do we have a complex OR statement buried in the middle, where common descent, history, culture, or language all figure in? Our first instinct is that the definition of a nation is a little fuzzy, and our instinct is right. An empirical approach to ground our discussion. Let's go through specific examples of groups that have been called nations. The Japanese, they line up with the definition perfectly. The Japanese at one point did have quite an empire, and there is a Japanese diaspora in the US and Brazil, but most people of Japanese ancestry live on the islands of Japan, speak the Japanese language, are governed by the Japanese state, and live in an essentially monoethnic polity. The Spanish, they have a nation-state today, but in the past they had an international empire that then contracted, leaving them mostly to themselves on the Iberian Peninsula. They left behind a global footprint in the form of 20 countries that speak Spanish, yet do not consider themselves part of the Spanish nation-state. The Turks, they are a multi-ethnic state today that is also the successor to an even larger empire, the Ottoman Empire, with a definitionally Byzantine history. The Israelis, their status as a nation-state changed with time. The Jewish people were once a stateless nation, a diasporic group united by common ancestry and tradition without a land or government to call their own. Then, within living memory, they founded the State of Israel. Herzl's work is a major inspiration for this book. The Catalonians, the Kurds, and the Palestinians, of course, for every Spain, Israel, or Turkey, there is a Catalonia, a Palestine, a Kurdistan. Namely a group that self-identifies as a nation and feels its national aspirations have been denied. These are stateless nations, as distinct from nation-states, without necessarily endorsing any particular cause. The Irish, they now have an independent Ireland, but famously didn't for many years under the British. A controversial issue is whether Northern Ireland should be part of the Republic of Ireland, or part of the UK. The Taiwanese, this group is recognized as a nation by some parties but by no means all. We can think of these as partially sovereign nations, with a measure of control over their own state and territory, but less than they'd like. The Americans, the Singaporeans, and the French, these states have tried, with varying success, to craft a common identity as a nation from the raw material of several different ethnic groups. Indeed, the Americans have, by some measures, been very successful in this effort, at least for a time. The Americans, the Singaporeans, and the French are explicitly proposition nations. The Chinese and the Indians, these gigastates are not really single nation states given the sheer multiplicity of different groups within each country's borders. However, those different groups didn't all recently arrive next to each other like a Burning Man encampment. They've been living alongside each other for centuries in a common civilization, with greater and lesser levels of past unification. So the grouping is more Lindy than more recent multi-ethnic states with less of a long-term track record, let alone the wholly arbitrary states left in the wake of colonialism. Some have used the term civilization state for these entities. You might even stretch this to encompass the European Union, though it is more of a transnational bureaucracy than an entity that celebrates European civilization. And for many Middle Eastern and African countries, the states don't really reflect the underlying nations at all. A clue here is the presence of horizontal or vertical lines on a map, lines that don't reflect the organic physical deserts, mountains, rivers, and cultural languages, marriages, religions, barriers that help define nations. Many of these imposed states are a parting gift from colonial empires. From these examples, we can already see quite a bit of variation. Nations with states, Japanese, Spanish, nations without states, Kurds, Catalonians, nations with partially sovereign states, Taiwan, multi-ethnic states that are trying to create proposition nations, America, Singapore. France imposed multi-ethnic states that don't even have a proposition to bind them. Many states formed as shotgun marriages in the aftermath of European colonialism, civilization states that are multi-ethnic, but have long-standing cultural ties that unify their constituent nations, China, India, just by touring this topic. We also see that the issue of what is a nation is still the hot button, the third rail, the pulse raiser, the argument starter. Because a nation granted legitimacy can claim territory and erect a polity, while a nation denied recognition remains landless and stateless, the stakes couldn't be higher for this seemingly abstract question. A philosophical approach. We just did some specific examples. Can we enunciate general principles that define which groups should be considered bona fide nations? Many scholars from the past to the recent present have taken a crack at this question. Here's a necessarily incomplete preface of their views, taken in part from Benner's chapter here and Kaufman's review here. First, the thinkers of the late 1700s and 1800s, writing during the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, or the revolutions of 1848. Rousseau, if a group of people voluntarily consents to being bound by the same governing authority, they are a nation. Marx, a nation is a convenient group supported by a great power to destabilize a rival. Regarding communism, the nation is a group to lead to acquire political supremacy and a boundary to transcend to unite the proletariat. Locke, if two groups lay claim to the same territory, the more rational and industrious should be considered a nation. John Stuart Mill, if a group consents to the same governing authority, and is capable of attaining control over a piece of land, they should be considered a nation. Mill's concept of utility, however, trumps consent. Hegel, a nation is formed by its institutions imbuing a sense of shared ethics. War tests that ethical duty and is not inherently evil, but a natural condition of anarchic interstate relations. J.G. Herder, if a group shares language and descent, it is a nation, a concept known as primordialism. Moreover, small nations should be independent from larger nations that want to assimilate them into different languages. J.G. Fichte, like Herder, separate languages and ethnicities define separate nations. Moreover, a state can build a nation through education, guiding the populace towards a shared cultural and linguistic identity. Ernest Renan. A nation is those with common glories and sacrifices in the past and the will to continue them in the present. The existence of a nation is represented by a daily plebiscite that constitutes the present consent of a people. Ernest Gellner, nations are peoples sharing, via schooling, language, culture, and forms of communication particularly adapted to modern society. Benedict Anderson, nations are just social constructs, imagined communities, based on linguistic connections driven by print capitalism. Eric Hobsbawm, nations must have a historic association with a current state. A long-established linguo-cultural administrative elite, and a proven capacity for conquest. These definitions both overlap and conflict. Some tensions include primordialism versus propositionism. A nation can be a group with shared ancestry, culture, and language, but it can also be based purely on ideas and voluntary association. Scale versus uniqueness. A nation needs sufficient scale to be able to defend itself, so it should adopt a broad definition of national membership. But it needs to also avoid becoming so assimilated into a large-scale group that there's no distinct culture to defend. Self-determination versus external sponsorship. A nation is based in part on self-identification as a nation, but in practice needs to also be capable of delivering real-world results, being rational and industrious, and of attracting the support of a great power patron. Imagined communities versus real linguo-cultural ties. A nation is an imagined community and a social construct, but it needs to share enough of the same language and culture to feasibly assemble that construct. These divergences mean there isn't yet a single test for whether a group is a nation. Though one can make a more or less persuasive case in any given instance by appealing to different standards. However, with modern tools, we might be able to tidy up that fuzziness. Later in this chapter, we'll introduce a computational approach to defining a nation that complements the empirical and philosophical approaches. And we'll talk about how these theories of national origin influence a startup society founder's strategy for customer acquisition, or in this case citizen acquisition. But for now, what is a nation? Perhaps it's just a group that can convince enough other people that it's a nation. What is a state? It's also worth spending time on the other half of the nation-state definition. What exactly is a state? The definitional approach. This helpful video enumerates 6 properties of a state. Order, a clearly defined territory. Population, one or more nations that live within that territory. Central government, the ability to create laws. Interstate sovereignty, in theory. Control over domestic affairs without interference by other states. Recognition, diplomatic recognition by other states. Domestic monopoly on violence. The ability to maintain order inside the territory. A failed state in the midst of civil war wouldn't fit, for example, because it wouldn't be able to prevent foreign powers from interfering. Item 4, nor would it be able to control violence domestically. Item 6. A micronation doesn't count because it lacks territory. Item 1, and population. Item 2. And an administrative subdivision of the U.S. like Arkansas also wouldn't count, because it lacks recognition by foreign states. Item 5, and control relative to Washington, D.C. Item 3. However, a subdivision can sometimes become an independent state. The comparative approach. How about a comparison? Precisely because they're so often conflated, it's worth addressing in detail just how a state differs from a nation. The state is a political and legal entity, while a nation is a cultural, ethnic, and psychological identity. The state is bound by laws and threat of force, while a nation is bound by sentiments and linguistic, genetic, cultural alignment. The state is top-down and hierarchical, while the nation is bottom-up and peer-to-peer. And, as above, the state has a fixed territory, a government and sovereignty over a territory, while a nation typically has shared language, culture, and/or ancestry. Nations may not always have a single state. The Kurds lack a state, while the Koreans are split into two states. Conversely, states may govern one or more nations. The British state governs the English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish nations, while the Soviet state governed more than 100 different nationalities. While some contend that the distinction between nation and state is an intrinsically European idea, there are actually different words for these concepts across languages. The pragmatic approach, perhaps the simplest test for whether something is a bona fide state, is whether it's a member of the United Nations General Assembly. Does it have sufficient diplomatic recognition? Is it considered a state by other entities we'd consider states? In a word, is it recognized? This is important because even the very largest groups of people, like the Chinese and the Indians, are outnumbered by the rest of the world. Social viability is necessary for state viability. A couple of excellent books on this topic are Invisible Countries and Not on the Map, which review edge cases like Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, Transnistria, Northern Cyprus, Somaliland, South Ossetia, and the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, Kosovo, and Taiwan. Each of these entities has a greater or lesser degree of internal state-likeness, with Taiwan being the most legit, but all of them lack some degree of full interstate recognition, often due to a powerful regional or global opponent. While we're discussing the UN, a better name than the United Nations might be that selected states. After all, many stateless nations don't have a seat in the United Nations General Assembly, like the Kurds, the Catalonians, or the Tibetans. And many countries that do have seats are more akin to multinational empires than single nation states. The philosophical approach, Keynes said, practical men, who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences, are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Meaning, if you don't know what intellectual software you're running, you're probably running it unconsciously. So, it's hard to survey the many thinkers that led to the modern state, because we don't always understand the full scope of their impact. We'll try anyway. Here's another necessarily imprecise set of summaries of what different political theorists thought about the state. Plato, the state should make possible the conditions under which everyone can provide for themselves and seek the good. Aristotle, all communities aim at some good, and the state is the highest kind of community, aiming at the highest of goods. Locke, the state is legitimate if it enforces contracts and acts as the guarantor of private property. Carlyle, the state should be run by a hero that provides order. Schmidt, the state embodies a clear friend-enemy distinction. Marx, the state is meant to organize the proletariat against the ruling class. Keynes, the state should intervene to smooth the business cycle and support full employment. Rules: the state distributes social goods and economic opportunities equally to its free citizens according to the theory of justice as fairness. Hobbes: the state possess absolute authority, and this powerful leviathan makes anti-social men behave in pro-social ways. Rousseau: the state is legitimate if people have consented to a social contract, in which they self-rule and ideally do not abdicate sovereignty to potentially disaligned representatives. Samuelson: the state is meant to provide public goods that private actors would not be able to supply. Lee Kuan Yew: the state should provide its people with the maximum enjoyment of freedoms and respect the family unit. The state should embrace multiple nations yet demand loyalty. Statecraft strategies and programming paradigms. Again, this isn't just desiccated theory. It's important to understand these ideas because they are used implicitly or explicitly by the founders and leaders of actually existing states. From a computer science standpoint, these schools of thought are statecraft strategies that are analogous to programming paradigms. That is, you can often solve the same problem from, say, an object-oriented, functional, or imperative standpoint. But certain problems are easier to tackle with a particular paradigm, while others become much harder. So too for these varying theories of the state. Moreover, rather than being used in isolation, these statecraft strategies are often fused within a single legal codebase, much as different programming paradigms can complement each other within a company's codebase. For example, Karl Marx's zero-sum worldview made it easy to justify a Soviet state with a massive Red Army to destroy the capitalist oppressors. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writing, by contrast, didn't give much justification for the use of force itself, but furnished a vision of consensual communistic utopia that sat just on the other side of the Red Army's liberating violence. Carl Schmitt and Thomas Carlyle are a roughly equivalent pairing on the right, with Schmitt advocating that a hero use state force against the enemy and Carlyle talking up the bounteous order that would arise as a result. Marx and Rousseau's failure mode was their departure from economic reality, as they didn't take into account self-interest. Schmitt and Carlyle's failure mode was their departure from political reality, as they didn't take into account the interests of the other guy. But their statecraft strategies were once influential enough to drive some of the most powerful states in world history, so we need to understand them, even if we must also discard them. Think about how PHP is a programming language that sucks, according to many engineers, yet somehow led to many of the most popular apps of all time, Facebook, WordPress, Slack, etc. And you'll get the point. It is also possible to run completely in another direction, and have a purely contractual state run on an implicitly hierarchian, Lockean paradigm, maximizing some measure of wealth without any of the meaning that the Marxist or Schmittian state narratives provide. That also has its vulnerabilities, as a vacuum of meaning can be filled by a rival whose statecraft strategy involves constant evangelism. This is why the Platonic, Aristotelian state narratives have a good point when they prioritize purpose. The strengths and weaknesses of various statecraft strategies can be discussed at length, and we'll return to this topic. But for now, before you design your ideal state, you should have some idea of what others thought their ideal state to be, and how that worked out. What does a nation-state look like on a map? The simple answer is that a nation-state is a colored blob on a map. But we can think of that map as a superposition of various underlying maps showing where members of the nation are located, for example, where the speakers of the language, those with shared alleles, and those with similar culture reside, overlaid on the legal boundaries of the state. Again, Japan is our canonical example. The underlying maps all line up. Most speakers of the Japanese language, most people with Japanese ancestry, most holders of the Japanese yen, most practitioners of Shintoism, and most people who are culturally Japanese live in the islands of Japan administered by the Japanese government. Other nations are much messier than that. Some nations have spread fractally around a territory, as in the Balkans. Some nations have spread around the world, as did the Jewish community pre-Israel, still true to a significant extent today. Some previously unified nations have been split between territories for historical reasons, as are North and South Korea. Other nations are defined by multiple overlapping maps, because one variable alone is not enough to delimit them. For example, if you just said that all people who speak Spanish are members of the Spanish nation, you would misclassify millions of people across continents who do not think of themselves as part of the same community. Some nation-states, like Indonesia, have odd-looking boundaries, in part, because they are really multinational states. Some nation-states, like France and the United Kingdom, have surprisingly distributed global footprints because they are really the remains of multinational empires. In general, the idealized nation-state is one where the members of a given group, the nation, are physically centralized within a single bounded set on the surface of the globe. That may seem trivial, but later in this chapter we'll explore physically decentralized polities in the context of network states. How were modern nation-states founded? There are a few different angles on the question of how nation-states get founded. The historical angle. The first angle is to think about when many states were founded on roughly the same principles at the same time. We can define a few critical moments in history. WW2 and Cold War, 1945 to 1991. Today's states were founded under the aegis of the post-war order. After World War II, within Europe large-scale population transfers created monoethnic states. Meanwhile, outside Europe, the colonies owned by Western European powers experienced decolonization, and then arguably, recolonization, by the USSR or USA respectively in the name of communism or capitalism. Another clutch of independent states arose after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. American Revolution, French Revolution, Great Divergence, 1776–1800s. Writers like Benedict Anderson date the rise of European nationalism in its modern sense to the Great Divergence of the early 1800s. After the French Revolution, which was in turn inspired by the American Revolution. 30 Years' War, Spanish-Dutch War, and Peace of Westphalia, 1618–1648. The Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics that had been kicked off by the Reformation, and ushered in the concept of states with bounded territorial sovereignty as opposed to the unbounded authority of the Catholic Church. Rise of mapmaking and print capitalism, 1500s. The rise of mapmaking technologies enabled the creation of accurate maps. We take this for granted today, but without good maps there were no explicit borders beyond terrain. Only gradual diminishment of the power of one sovereign as its territory bled into that of another. Ancient era. Civilization states like China and India date their origins back to antiquity, and can point to certain continuities of language, culture, and religious practice. Prehistory. Primordialists argue that the nations that underpin states predate written history, as their linguistic, genetic, and cultural bonds stretch back thousands of years. In other words, nations are naturally occurring phenomena, more like the periodic table of the elements than a social construct, with boundaries that are obvious in a Potterian sense. Any real modern nation-state was in this sense founded millennia ago. Importantly, the whole world didn't get modern nation-states at the same time. For example, Westphalian sovereignty was initially established within Western Europe, but not outside it. European nation-states were supposed to honor each other's borders, in principle at least, so they went abroad to conquer other places. But these junction points in history are still useful ways to think about the founding of nation-states. with one or the other looming larger depending on whether one is more focused on that nation, that state, or that nation-state combination. From a practical standpoint, clearly you can't found a civilization state like China or India without thousands of years of history. But you might be able to distill a new nation, like the Mormons, Est, 1830, from the mass of Americans, or alternatively architect an impressive new nation-state like Estonia, Est. 1991, from the same nation oppressed by the dreary Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic. The patronage angle and alternative approach is to look at the details of how specific nation-states were founded. One thing that pops out to us when studying enough of these histories is that national independence is not solely a matter of self-determination. Because the fate of many nations is not determined wholly by their own efforts. For example, the Soviets were anti-imperialist, when that meant getting Western sympathetic capitalists out, and Soviet sympathetic communists in. The French supported the fledgling American nation when that meant poking a thumb in the eye of the British rivals. And today's Americans haven't been too vocal on the Kurds or Yemenis given their alliances with the Turkish and Saudi states, but are extremely enthusiastic about the Ukrainians, Taiwanese, and Uyghurs given their conflicts with the Russian and Chinese states. As such, to achieve its ambitions, a stateless nation may also need a patron, a kind of venture capitalist great power. Self-determination is not enough. The military angle, many countries were founded within living memory, but because they were often founded by force, some don't believe it's possible to found new countries without force. Or is it? They say you cannot found a Pentagon, they don't say you can't found a competitor to the post office, or the taxi medallion system, or to NASA. They instead go right to the thing where we don't have comparably recent foundings, or do we? After all, the Pentagon itself was built by human beings just like you and me in 1943. India, Israel, and Singapore were likewise founded in 1947, 1948, and 1965 respectively, and have their own Defense Department equivalents. Of course, there are other interpretations of this challenge. It could mean, okay, it happened a while ago, but I don't think the Pentagon forming process can be repeated, or perhaps, it would be bad to raise a massive new army, as that would be destabilizing, or even, come on, you can't found the most powerful military in the world from scratch. But answering these kinds of questions presents an embedded catch-22. Either someone thinking about starting new countries must want to create a powerful new military, dangerous, or else they don't have any guns and will get crushed by those that do, dangerously naive. One answer is that you don't need to get full sovereignty but can instead contract with an existing sovereign for defense. In fact, this is actually what most real countries already do, few truly have full sovereignty, as most contract out the defense in a similar manner way to the US or, nowadays, China. Another answer is that you could write a book just on this, and perhaps we'll need to add another chapter, but for a fundamentally digital entity with physical decentralization around the world. The primary mode will be non-violent digital defense through secrecy, pseudonymity, decentralization, and encryption. In different ways, Google and Bitcoin protect many millions of people's digital footprint without an enormous army. Why were nation-states founded? Another way of asking this is, what came before the nation-state? The short answer is that people had different identity stacks. In Europe, the populace didn't think of themselves as all being primarily French or German till much later on. They instead thought of themselves on the basis of their feudal lord or region, Brittany, Prussia, or religion, e.g., Protestant, Catholic. Transnational entities like the Catholic Church also claimed dominion over all believers, no matter where they might be. So there was a question as to whether Pope or King had ultimate authority in any given jurisdiction. Wars ensued. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 resolved these issues and is considered by many to be the origin of the European nation-state. The Westphalian Peace divided territory by lines on a map. Over each territory thus delineated, there was a government that represented the people in that territory, with the right to exercise force on their behalf. And these sovereign states were supposed to leave each other alone. In theory, the state was meant to be an innovation in violence reduction. You stay in your lane, I stay in mine. Clear sovereigns would keep domestic order, and the principle of national sovereignty would deter aggression from abroad. It didn't entirely work out like that, of course, both intrastate and interstate conflicts still occurred. But the abstraction of nation-states may still have been preferable to the preceding era of fuzzy-bordered empires and conflicting sovereigns. How does a nation-state expand and contract? There are at least 4 ways a nation-state expands. Demographically, by reproduction or immigration. A nation grows when it sees more birth than death. A state grows when one of its constituent nations experiences demographic growth, or when it adds immigrants, which may be from a different nation. Note that there can be a difference here between expansion of the state and the nation. Geographically, by conquest, e.g., Ivan the Terrible's expansion of Russia; by acquisition, e.g., the Louisiana Purchase; or by agreement, e.g., Singapore's involuntary separation from Malaysia. Economically, by trade and opening of markets. This is not always peaceful. See the British East India Company, Smedley Butler, and the Opium Wars. Ideologically, by education and conversion. Revolutionary France invested heavily in educating all citizens to speak French, expanding the self-identified French nation. Similarly, Christian, Muslim, and communist groups spent immense effort on evangelism. Of course, while some of this evangelism grows the support base of a nation-state, like Maoism did for the PRC and arguably Wahhabism did for Saudi Arabia, other kinds of viral ideas cut across the boundaries of state and nation alike in destabilizing ways. How did states influence nations, and vice versa? Nation-state formation is bidirectional. Nations create states which influence nations, and so on. While a nation must come first. Many of history's most successful nation-states drew adjacent, and then non-adjacent, people into the founding population by means ranging from cultural appeal to rape and pillage. Prior to Garibaldi, only about 2.5% of Italians spoke what we now know as Italian, but what was then the Florentine dialect of Italian. Similarly, before the French Revolution, less than 50% of France spoke today's official variety of French. And until Bismarck's unification of Germany, there was rivalry between Prussia and Austria, German dualism, for exactly how and whether a Germany should be formed. A related phenomenon is the feedback loop between political borders and national culture. The 38th parallel didn't have pre-existing historical significance in Korean culture, but after the Korean War the rate of intermarriage between the new North Korean and South Korean groups plummeted. This state of affairs has persisted for 70 years. The longer it continues, the larger the cultural gap between the two groups. Hard political boundaries of this kind serve much the same purpose as natural physical boundaries in the past, like rivers, mountains, and deserts. They impede allelic and cultural diffusion, and thus contribute to nation-forming dynamics. There's a feedback loop between the political, territorial and the linguistic, genetic, cultural. What is not a nation-state? What is not a nation-state? I don't mean this in the trivial way that a banana is not a nation-state. I mean, what is another large-scale way of organizing people in the physical world that is not a nation-state? Put another way, to understand what something is, we need to understand what it is not. We live in a world of nation-states, so conceptualizing something different is difficult. The ideal counterexamples are things that are close, but not quite there. Here are a few. Multi-ethnic empires like the Soviet Union were not traditional nation-states because they had more than one nationality within their boundaries. Stateless nations like the Kurds are not nation-states because they lack a formally recognized territory and government. Transnational movements like the Catholic Church are not nation-states because the set of all believers is not contained within a territorial state that it administers. The Church does have Vatican City, but that is about as ceremonial as the British royal family. Terrorist groups like ISIS, which operate across borders and have seized territory at times, aren't considered states because they lack diplomatic recognition due to their heinous crimes. That said, the Soviet communists were the ISIS of the day, and they just had to hold out 16 years for FDR to recognize them. So with enough persistence, this designation can change. Nomadic tribes like the Romani and Maasai are not nation-states, because they migrate between countries. Indeed, most of humanity used to live like this, with farming, soldiering being a relatively recent innovation, and we may return to something like it with the advent of digital nomadism. Multi-jurisdictional corporations like Google have more people on their servers than most countries, and do control huge chunks of their users' lives, such as their messages and balances. However, they are a transitional form towards our concept of the network state. As their users lack the national consciousness of a nation and their governance lacks the qualities we've come to expect from a state. Ethnic diasporas like the Japanese or Armenian diasporas are not nation-states. They may have business districts, and some degree of community organization in those regions, but they are just a tendril of a nation rather than a full nation. And certainly lack the properties of a full state. Local clans like the Pashtun and Hazara of Afghanistan are not nation-states. They are different nations within a failed state. Supranational entities like the European Union, WTO, or IMF are also not nation-states, and are more similar to the Catholic Church in terms of their cross-jurisdictional influence. 152 What technological developments underpin the modern nation-state system? We don't typically think of mapmaking, printing, and shooting as novel activities, because the underlying technologies were invented so many generations ago. But they were each foundational to our modern concept of states with borders, where men with guns enforce written laws. Mapmaking. It's only possible to have a map of the world which we divide into nation-states if we have a map of the world. You don't have to be a cartographic connoisseur to know that such a map did not exist in 1492. When Columbus sailed the ocean blue in search of an India to trade with. Ye olde maps with "here be dragons" had to be painstakingly crafted. Prior to modern GPS, there was an enormous tech stack around mapmaking, including compasses, telescopes, and celestial navigation. Printing. Not just the printing press, but the entire practice of print capitalism helped give rise to the nation-state. Just as Facebook and Google wanted everyone on the internet so they could expand their customer base. The new commercial printers of the 1500s wanted everyone to speak the same language so they could maximize sales for their goods. Shooting. God made men, but some cult made him equal. Feudalism was enforced by horseback riding knights in shining armor with heavy swords. Guns changed that. Others have written about the transition to the gun age, but in short, guns reduced the importance of physical inequality. Any man, or, eventually, woman, with a gun could kill any other man, even if the shooter was old and frail and the shootee was Sir Lancelot himself. The advent of firearms, and crossbows, and cannons destabilized the feudal hierarchy. A strong right arm was suddenly worth less than a strong left brain. As the technology and supply chain required to produce muskets was suddenly worth more. The gun helped catalyze the transition from feudal hierarchy to nationalist republic and helped promote the republican ideals of the American and French revolutions. So, a combination of mapmaking, printing, and shooting helped set the stage for the post-Westphalian nation-state, where a map delimited borders, a printed document established the law. And a guy with a gun shot you for crossing those borders or breaking the law. On network states, the network state system starts from different assumptions than the nation-state system, which you can review here. What is a network state? Earlier we gave descriptions of the network state in one sentence, 1,000 words, and one essay. We also showed what a million-person version looks like on a map, see above. Here's that one-sentence definition again. A network state is a social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized founder, a capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility. An integrated cryptocurrency, a consensual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories, a virtual capital, and an on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. Keep in mind that this definition references the final form of a diplomatically recognized network state. But you can't get diplomatic recognition for a made-up country right off the bat, so you can't found a network state directly. Instead, you found a startup society and hope to scale it into a network state that achieves diplomatic recognition from a pre-existing government. Just as you don't found a public company directly, but instead found a startup company and hope to scale it into a public company that achieves diplomatic recognition from a pre-existing exchange like the Nasdaq. Moreover, to extend the analogy, the process of scaling a startup involves waypoints like seed startup, Series B startup, and unicorn prior to achieving the status of a public company. So too, there are at least two waypoints between startup society and network state worth noting, the network union and the network archipelago. Turning a startup society into a network union makes it a digital community capable of collective action. Turning that network union into a network archipelago manifests that collective action in the real world, as the community crowdfunds physical properties around the world and connects them via the internet. Finally, an impressive enough network archipelago can achieve diplomatic recognition from an existing government, thereby becoming a true network state. The definition: that's the process of getting to a network state. Now let's drill into each part of our proposed definition. A social network. The people of a network state form their nation online. Social rather than geographic proximity is the core organizing principle. But this isn't a typical social network like Facebook or Twitter, it's what we call a one network where there is just one coherent community present, rather than many separate communities as on Facebook or Twitter. It's not quite a complete graph, everyone doesn't have to be friends with every single other node, but it's much closer to that than a typical social network. Admission to this social network is selective, people can lose their account privileges for bad behavior, and everyone who's there has explicitly opted in by applying to join. That application process could involve public proof of alignment via writing, a career history that demonstrates common values, or the investment of time and energy into the society to obtain digital assets. Joining the network that underpins a network state is not a purely economic proposition, not something that can be bought with money alone. It's a concrete version of Rousseau's social contract as a literal smart contract, one that all sign before entering, a way to turn an abstract proposition into an actual nation. A moral innovation. A network state grows out of a startup society that is premised on a moral innovation, where everyone within the society thinks some principle X is good that the rest of the world thinks is bad, or vice versa. This is the proposition part of a proposition nation. For example, the moral innovation could be as trivial seeming as sugar bad, or 24/7 internet bad, or as heavyweight as this traditional religion is good. The moral innovation draws people in. It gives a reason for the society to exist, a purpose that's distinct from the outside world, a universalist complement to the particularist sense of national consciousness. An ideological mission that others will nod their heads at even if they don't share. Okay, I understand why someone might want a sugar-free society, or a Benedict option community. The reason we put such a high priority on a moral innovation is that missionary societies outcompete mercenary ones, not just in theory but in practice. For example, the historian Paul Johnson once pointed out that the for-profit colonies in America failed, but the religious ones had the cohesion and commitment to make it through the brutal winters. See 11 o'clock here. We discuss this at length in the chapter on the One Commandment. A sense of national consciousness. Everyone in a network state feels like they're part of the same community, sharing the same values and culture. They're a nation in the sense of Renan, to have done great things together, to want to do more. Again, it's much more like a complete graph than a typical social network, as almost every node is friendly with a very large fraction of other nodes. A recognized founder. A state, like a company, needs a leader, especially early on. But truly strong leadership comes from consent and buy-in, not propaganda or force. Hence, it's important to have a recognized founder, one that people actually listen to and choose to follow by joining the community. Can that founder break up the Triforce, splitting their authority into some kind of multisig? Sure, just like the founder of a startup company can choose to give up board seats. But it's easy to give away power and hard to consolidate it. And you need that power sometimes to make hard but important non-consensus decisions. 153. That's why dual-class stock to maintain control is used by both the US establishment and their opponents. As with giving up corporate board seats, giving up some power may be the right thing to do at some point for the network state founder. But in the event that a network state degenerates into a bureaucracy, as many mature organizations do, a key part of the network state model is that it is, like the startup model, built to always allow peaceful exit. Anyone can, at any time, leave to found a new startup society and try scaling it into a network state. A capacity for collective action. This is tightly related to the concept of national consciousness. It's a combination of collective purpose, which is like the mission statement of a company, but for a community, and the capacity to act on that purpose. First, let's understand the idea of collective purpose through some examples. The Puritans wanted to build a city on a hill. The Japanese, after the Meiji Restoration, replaced their previous mission statement of revere the emperor, expel the barbarians with enrich the country, strengthen the military, turning their society around 180 degrees and thereby building the first non-white industrialized power. And while the process of Indian independence and partition was messy beyond belief, on the other side, the collective purpose of independence unified the Indian nation in a way it never had been before. With hundreds of so-called princely states, and countless ethnic groups now integrated into a single India. 154. As one more example, JFK once focused the US on the common purpose of achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. This was a collective purpose different from but allied with the also valid zero-sum goal of defeating communism. It was perhaps the penultimate great thing the US accomplished as a unified country, with the defeat of the Soviet Union as the last. These collective purposes helped unify their respective nations. They may be imperfect, but once there's no collective purpose at all, people start wondering who they are. Who are we? That directionlessness leads to what we see in today's US, split into two tribes whose only collective purpose is to win a zero-sum game against the other. A game each thinks it must win before being able to move forward to the promised land. Next, supposing we have a collective purpose, what does collective action towards that purpose look like? This is why the process of building a network state includes a network union. From the very outset, it organizes people to work together for the benefit of their chosen community through the familiar interface of their screens. This, again, is quite different from current social networks like Twitter, which give individual scores for likes and followers but no team dashboard. No way of setting and achieving tangible goals as a group. An in-person level of civility. In the 90s and 2000s, it was attention-getting when people were grossly uncivil to each other online, as it was a funny contrast to the generally civil offline world. Now it's just old, and not funny anymore. Moreover, internet ideologies have emerged that justify random nastiness with slogans like civility is tone policing, or toxicity is social defense. Yet a society where everyone is constantly disrespectful to everyone else doesn't seem like a progressive, public-spirited society. And the conservative US of the 1950s managed to maintain a strong level of self-defense because they were internally civil. So whether one is coming from the left or right, pulling together a high-trust society means in-person levels of civility towards community fellow members, both offline and online. High trust in turn comes from alignment towards a collective purpose and a sense of national consciousness. An integrated cryptocurrency. This is the digital backbone of the network state. It manages the internal digital assets, the smart contracts, the Web3 citizen logins, the birth and marriage certificates, the property registries, the public national statistics, and essentially every other bureaucratic process that a nation-state manages via pieces of paper. Because it's protected by encryption, it can coordinate all the functions of a state across the borders of legacy nation-states. An archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories. This is the physical footprint of the network state. Rather than buying territory in one place, or trying to negotiate sovereignty up front, you build the community in the cloud and then crowdfund physical real estate on the earth. That's office space, yes, but also homes and shops, just spread all around the world in clusters, rather than concentrated in one place. You network these clusters together using the internet into a network archipelago, eventually using newer technologies to make them more real. For example, you can make the flag of a network state appear to anyone with augmented reality glasses and the right NFT, as per this visual. You can also make doors open on command for community members, where their ENS name is their login. The point is that a network state is not a purely digital thing. It has a substantial physical component, all the buildings around the world crowdfunded by its members. A consensual government limited by a social smart contract. Now we get to the government. Many people make the mistake of thinking the laws, or the land, come first when starting a new state. But laws should only come after the formation of an organic people, of a network nation, not before. That's because laws encode the implicit understanding of a people. Contra the concept that you can't legislate morality, that's all you can do, set up laws that reflect the moral consensus of a people as to what is encouraged and discouraged, acceptable and optional, mandatory and forbidden. How is that moral consensus arrived at? It could be through a 51% democracy, where 51% of people can outvote the other 49%, or it could be via a 100% democracy, where 100% of people have migrated into a system and can migrate out at any time. Or it could be via one of the zillions of techniques for satisfying preferences described in the literature. The specifics don't matter as much as the ethics. That is, what makes a government legitimate is not process but substance. Point 155 Given the consent of the governed, any form of government is internally legitimate. The question is then whether it will be considered externally legitimate, whether the world at large will accept this government, but that is an empirical question more than an ethical one. Put another way, if people can opt into bungee jumping and skydiving, if euthanasia is legal, then experimenting with self-governmental systems that vary dramatically from the status quo should also be legal. Many of them won't work, but many projects don't work either. That doesn't mean we stop people from trying. One way of thinking about this is that the typical Ford customer doesn't care about how Ford's internal affairs are managed. The buyer doesn't care whether Ford is organized by product or by function, whether they're run top-down by the CEO or in a consultative way with the board, whether they pay market salaries or incentivize more heavily with stock. Ford could be a holacracy or a co-op. So long as everyone has consented to be governed by the Ford CEO by signing an employee agreement, and can leave if that agreement is no longer congenial. Ford's internal arrangements are ethical. This logic works so long as you can opt out of Ford's ecosystem completely. Have you driven a Ford lately? It's trickier when it's something like Google, which is so powerful that it's hard for the non-Chinese portion of the planet to fully opt out of. Then you might want some kind of say in what goes on inside the Googleplex. Still, most companies aren't Google. Setting aside the edge case of inescapable global ubiquity, for now, the ethical case for allowing opt-in experiments in corporate governance is pretty strong. For taking a broad view of the consent of the governed. Now extend that idea to non-corporate governance, with coin governance as a proof point, and network states as an endpoint. Questions arise. How could consent be given? How could others measure that consent was freely given? And what if someone wants to retract that consent, perhaps right before they're subject to an act of governance they don't like? In practice, we say that a user has consented to be governed by a startup society if he has signed a social smart contract that gives a system administrator limited privileges over that user's digital life in return for admission to the startup society. This portmanteau term combines Rousseau's concept of the social contract with the blockchain concept of the smart contract. Signing the social smart contract is very similar to depositing your funds with a centralized exchange, or locking them up in a smart contract with admin keys. You're taking conscious risk with an on-chain asset in return for admission to a digital ecosystem. Now imagine using your ENS 156 to log in to a startup society, thereby giving it limited privileges over your account in order to enter that startup society. What does that login entail? The simplest version of this is using your ENS to log into a startup society community. A more sophisticated version is using your ENS to enter a part of the so-called open metaverse governed by a startup society. But the most interesting version is using your ENS to log into offline territory owned by a startup society, as in the aforementioned example where an ENS handshake opens a smart lock, or the one where it shows a glowing sigil. You might also have to put down a deposit to physically enter a startup society managed territory. You can extrapolate the DNS login to physical world example dramatically. As more physical territories are crowdfunded by a startup society, and more smart devices within those territories are owned by the society, it can exert consensual digital governance within those territories on all who opted in by signing the social smart contract. For example, if someone misbehaves within a given startup society-owned jurisdiction, after a Kleros-style digital trial, their deposits could be frozen and their ENS locked out of all doors for a time period as a punishment. This is at first blush similar to what's already happening in both the West and China. where Canadian trucker funds are being frozen and WeChat QR codes are being used as instruments of digital control, but with one enormous difference, which is that if we can build many different startup societies to choose from, then there is much more practical consent of the governed. Because there are many startup societies to choose from with explicit social smart contracts. Essentially, the key insight is that government is becoming synonymous with digital government. In any US establishment-controlled territory, your Google account will soon be frozen for crossing the US establishment. In any CCP-controlled territory, your WeChat account can be frozen for crossing the CCP. But in any crypto-anarchic territory, there may not be much in the way of functional digital services at all. So if one wants modernity constrained by cryptography, the concept of the social smart contract is one way to achieve consensual limited government, to limit what a government can do by tightly limiting its access to your digital identity and resources. Much like you can control exactly how much you deposit onto a centralized exchange. That sounds good at first. Then it sounds bad. Because if governance is limited solely to the digital realm, only to on-chain assets and smart locks, how does a startup society deal with physical criminals? The short answer is that for a long time, it doesn't. It leaves that to the surrounding legacy society, much like a centralized crypto exchange collaborates with traditional offline law enforcement. Eventually, if and when that startup society becomes a network state, in the sense of achieving diplomatic recognition from a legacy sovereign, then it can potentially take on physical law enforcement duties. In the meantime, physical law enforcement itself is gradually turning into something done with autonomous robots, whether they be legged robodogs, rolling cameras, or flying drones. So more law enforcement is being done from a command line. And that trend gradually converges with the concept of digital law enforcement by a network state. To summarize, when we say that a network state has consensual government limited by a social smart contract, we mean that it exercises authority over a digital, and, eventually, physical, sphere constituted solely of those people who've opted into its governance by signing a social smart contract with their ENS names. In much the same way they might opt in to the governance of a centralized exchange by depositing coins there. A virtual capital. A network state is physically distributed, but its people still digitally assemble in one place. That cloud assembly point could initially be something as modest as a Discord channel, but will eventually be a private subnetwork of the open metaverse. That means a virtual reality (VR) environment with parts that can be seamlessly projected into the physical world with augmented reality (AR) glasses, so that you can see digital people, buildings, or objects in the real world, like this. Access to a network state's virtual capital, like everything else in a network state, is gated by Web3 login limited to citizens. The most ambitious version of this allows community members to gather online to create virtual architectural blueprints for new physical nodes of the network state, as per this tweet. The reason this is feasible is that architecture is moving to VR. You could imagine a much higher resolution version of Minecraft that gets materialized into the physical world by a crowd-funded contractor, or by community members with construction experience themselves. Think about the scene from Fight Club where the camera swivels around the room to show price tags on everything, and now imagine that in VR. With the cost to materialize each virtual structure in the physical world hovering above it. An on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint. A distributed society needs a distributed census. Unlike the US Census, and more like Facebook's census of its user base, a startup society's census can be conducted in real time rather than every 10 years. But a skeptical world won't just take those numbers on faith, given a fledgling startup society's incentive to overestimate them. They may trust the US government, or even Facebook, a public company, on its audited user numbers, but not some upstart startup society, not without some proof. But how do you prove that a given startup society really has 10,000 residents and $1 billion in annual income and 10 square meters in its real estate footprint? Each of these elements can be established via on-chain data. We already have techniques for proof of human, proof of income, via on-chain accounting, and proof of real estate, via blockchain real estate. We can get into technical detail on how you solve the crypto oracle problem of getting off-chain data reliably onto the blockchain. But the short version is that you can use a statistical estimator to take into account the fact that individual oracles may have errors. By accumulating the censuses of all startup societies in a hypothetical nation real estate pop.com site similar to coinmarketcap.com, you could track in real time the number of startup society members, the acreage of real estate owned by those members, and their on-chain GDP. 157. Attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. Now we come to the main event, diplomatic recognition. Diplomatic recognition by a pre-existing government is what distinguishes a network state from a startup society. Just as diplomatic recognition by an exchange like the Nasdaq distinguishes a public company from a startup. Diplomatic recognition requires a putative state to have clout, and clout is in turn established by a publicly verifiable on-chain census of population, income, and real estate. To prove that your growing society is as large as you say it is. That's why the aforementioned census is important. Putting all that together, we can see that the definition of a network state culminates in attaining diplomatic recognition from a pre-existing government, which requires far more substance, leadership, physical presence, and long-term commitment than a typical online community, or even a cryptocurrency. It may be a LARP, but it's not done on a lark. Breaking the definition, you can start to see why we have several parts to the definition. If you subtract one part, you get something that doesn't quite match our intuition of what the next version of the nation state should be. Let's do that, subtracting each part just to see how it breaks. No social network. If there's no social network, you have no digital profiles, no messaging, no community fora, no mass media, and no easy way to recruit from the internet. You'd essentially be living an Amish life, relying on pieces of paper or offline cues to determine who was part of your new state and how they interacted. This isn't going to succeed the nation state. No recognized founder. With no recognized leader, you have no way of making contentious decisions or setting the agenda. 158. A founder is the best kind of leader, because they have the legitimacy associated with building an organization from scratch. Unlike a dictator, their authority isn't forced upon the population, and anyone can exit at any time. And unlike a media oligarchy, a founder's authority doesn't arise from propagandistic bombardment but from free choice. No sense of national consciousness. If there is no sense of national consciousness, there is no nation underpinning the network state. It's just a bunch of random people with nothing in common. No capacity for collective action. A group of people that lacks a capacity for collective action, like most online communities, frankly, isn't going to get anywhere. 159. Even if they have national consciousness. Without the capacity to organize, which arises in part from a leader, they certainly can't build a state. No in-person level of civility. A group of people that constantly tears each other down won't build an outhouse together, let alone a state. More deeply, the folks who throw around slogans like civility is tone policing or kill your heroes are actually engaged in endless status competition. because they have rejected the current hierarchy but not yet accepted a new one. In a functioning, legitimate hierarchy, see diagram here, there's a mechanism for dispute resolution that doesn't involve summoning a mob for every slight. No integrated cryptocurrency. After the financial deplatforming of Western proles and foreign elites, of Canadian truckers and 145 Russians, it's clear that digital finance is a weapon of war. So without a sovereign digital currency, and, more generally, a sovereign system of record, there is no sovereignty. 160 No archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories. You can do many things online, but not everything. Without physical territory you can't build FDA-free zones, or NRC-free areas, or the keto kosher community, or many kinds of substantive parallel societies. You also can't meet, mate, mingle, and do all the other things humans do in person. And most importantly, you're not going to be taken seriously as a successor to the nation-state without a large physical footprint. The approach of knitting together crowd-funded physical territory into a network archipelago addresses these issues. No virtual capital. Network states are not city-states. City-states were defeated by nation-states for a reason: they are physically centralized and have limited scale. So particularist city-states populated by small ethnic groups get rolled up by universalist nation-states, or empires with many ethnic groups. 161 That's the reason a network state has a virtual capital rather than a physical one. Think of it as remote first, but for a society. In a remote company, nothing officially exists unless it's online, in an internal system of record like GitHub. Similarly, in a remote society, nothing officially exists unless it's on-chain, in the blockchain system of record for that society. Put another way, if you don't consciously set the capital of your network state to be virtual, it'll be physical. And if it's physical, the capital is centralized in one place, and can get invaded by a nation-state. But if it's instead a virtual capital, with a backend that is encrypted and on-chain, then, in the fullness of time, you can host an entire subset of the metaverse there. Assuming block space increases as bandwidth did. No on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint. The US Census is in the US Constitution for a reason: you need to know something about your people to run a government. But for a network state, the challenges are different than those that faced the Founding Fathers. The hard part isn't how to collect the data. With modern technology it can be slurped up and dashboarded in real time. Rather than collected every 10 years on millions of pieces of paper. No, the hard part is getting people to believe the data, given the huge incentives for faking the numbers. 162. That means establishing a cryptographically auditable information supply chain, a transparent way of gathering the numbers for the network state census. That means showing the work so that people don't need to trust you, and can run the computation themselves. 163. Why is this important? Think again about the emergence of Bitcoin. Price was a signal of strength. Millions of trades across dozens of exchanges produced a signal that was reliable enough for companies and eventually governments to act upon. Price is why Bloomberg listed Bitcoin on a ticker in 2013. And price is why El Salvador recognized Bitcoin as a sovereign currency in 2021. We're not talking about the short-term price here, which is and will be highly volatile, but the long-term price, the secular trend. Similarly, if people can check for themselves that there's a startup society that has built itself into a network archipelago with 10 square meters of land, over $10 billion in annual income, and 100k people, then that starts to become a society worthy of diplomatic recognition. No measure of diplomatic recognition. Many libertarians don't get the concept of diplomatic recognition, just like many progressives don't get the desirability of starting new countries, so this point is worth discussing. What happens if you don't have diplomatic recognition? Then you aren't in the club of legitimate states. That means any government can invade you at will, and the others will just shrug. It also means you don't have access to things like sovereign debt markets. You can't ink trade or passport deals. You likely can't buy many goods and services that corporations or states sell only to other states, because you're not considered a legitimate government by the rest of the market. You certainly can't write new regulations for your jurisdiction, because others do not recognize your lawful authority over that jurisdiction, and can, again, invade you at will. Basically, without diplomatic recognition, you aren't considered real. That's why micronations don't work. They have no organic community, so they have no answer to the question of you and what army. And even more importantly, no answer to the question of you and what legitimacy. You can think of diplomatic recognition by a pre-existing state as a non-binding commitment to not invade. Subsequent to recognition, the startup society now gains the ability to write laws governing the physical world in their patch of territory without being invaded. At least by the recognizing state. 164. This is why we require diplomatic recognition in the definition of a network state. This gives you a sense of why each of the parts of the definition exist. A network state is at least as complex as a nation state, but the difference is that the latter already exists, so we take for granted how it works. What's next? Once the first diplomatic recognition comes, and the first true network state arises, more will follow. That means we need to start thinking about the network state system. What is the network state system? The next step is to outline the assumptions of the network state system as a whole. Read this and compare it to those of the nation-state system. Digital first. The digital network of the Internet is primary. Composition. A network state is composed of a national network, the equivalent of the nation, and a governance network, the analog of the state. Unlike a typical social network, a national network self-identifies as a nation. Unlike a typical social network company, a governance network is set up by that national network as the legitimate government of that digital people. Terra incognita returns. The network state system assumes many pieces of the Internet will become invisible to other subnetworks. In particular, small network states may adopt invisibility as a strategy. You can't hit what you can't see. Terra nullis returns. The network state system further assumes that unclaimed digital territory always exists in the form of new domain names, crypto usernames, plots of land in the metaverse, social media handles, and accounts on new services. Bottom-up migration of people. The network state system embraces the fuzzy division of the Internet into different sovereign subnetworks. It is a probabilistic digital division of people rather than a deterministic physical division of land. People migrate digitally and physically between network states. The citizenry is as dynamic as the land of a nation-state is static. N networks per citizen. Unlike the nation-state system, where most people have citizenship in only one state, in the network state system, every person can in principle be a member of more than one state. Just as they can hold passports in more than one country, or be holders of more than one cryptocurrency, or be users of more than one social network. Of course, they can spend most of their time in one network state. Legitimacy from physical migration and digital choice. The power of network states is constrained by consent and cryptography. First, recall that the governance network of a given network state is the analog to the state of a traditional country. This governance network only has control over those digital citizens, netizens, that have opted in, individually or collectively, to its governance. Much as one explicitly signs an employment contract when joining a company or implicitly signs a social contract when stepping across a border. A given national network can choose a governance network as an administrator, thereby forming, or joining, a network state with an on-chain record of the collective decision. Or an individual can join a network state on their own. Cryptography ensures that this choice is demonstrably free and uncoerced, because no state can easily seize an individual's private keys. Cryptography further guarantees basic rights like freedom of speech, free migration, private property, freedom of digital assembly and the like, so long as each user has exclusive access to their private keys. Decentralized administration. The group of people that administers a network state, which we call a governance network, is composed of a founder, chief executive and their engineers. They write laws in code to specify what is mandatory, encouraged, discouraged, and forbidden. These laws are interpreted by impartial servers and enforced by cryptography. In the network state system, each social subnetwork can choose which governance network administers them, as determined both by their physical location and where the digital property lies. Over time, this means polycentric law. People in a given physical area can switch between network states, and thus governance providers, just as they switch between Uber and Lyft as taxi regulators. Or Bitcoin and Ethereum as monetary regulators. Domestic monopoly of root access. The governance network of a network state has root access to an administrative interface where law enforcement can flip digital switches as necessary to maintain or restore domestic order. Just like the sysadmins of today's tech companies. Of course, postulating the existence of such an interface presupposes a world where everything from money to messaging, doors to dwellings, farms to factories, flying drones to walking droids can be controlled from a single computer, but that world isn't far off. And today there are few checks on the digital power of the tech companies that are bringing it into being. The network state system checks this power in two ways. By maintaining private keys, so foreign states and corporations cannot interfere in domestic affairs, and by enabling exit, so citizens can execute financial and electoral votes of no confidence if need be. Both as individuals and as groups. International sovereignty via cryptography. For a network state, sovereignty is private keys. If access to the aforementioned administrative interface is controlled by private keys rather than a username-password combination, then the same encryption techniques that make it difficult for an outsider to seize an individual's private keys can make it difficult for a foreign rival to steal a legitimate government's private keys. This is a completely new way of defending sovereignty, a complement and/or replacement for the military. Digital diplomatic recognition. Network states can recognize each other bilaterally, similar to an API integration, or multilaterally, e.g., by supporting the same blockchains. When people exit to other network states, whether digitally or physically, they bring their most valuable possessions with them in the form of private keys. Some of these keys give access to property in global blockchains, others give access to physical goods like cars and houses. And still others give access to records hosted on state-run chains, like the netizen profile in the network state they just left. Diplomatic recognition is then about interoperability and compatibility, at the file formats and on-chain records used by one network state honored by another. Chains manage cooperation and constraint. Public blockchains are the equivalent of international law in a network state system. They facilitate economic and social cooperation between network states and their netizens, but also constrain those states with cryptographically binding code. Pax Bitcoinica. The ultimate guarantor of exit, and of the network state system at large, is Bitcoin. As cryptocurrency rises in strength, Bitcoin or something like it becomes a government of governments. It sits above every state and constrains it from printing infinite quantities of money, from lawlessly seizing the funds of its citizens, and from waging forever war. In doing so, it limits that which will never limit itself. And even if the Bitcoin protocol specifically fails, or its cryptography has a bug, the concept of cryptocurrency and the choice it represents will not disappear from this earth. Assumption, digital primary, physical secondary. One point we touched on above, but that bears repeating, is that the network state system assumes the world has flipped to digital first. All non-trivial human-created events start in the cloud and then, if important, are printed out into the physical world. Think about anything a human does today. All office work is online, as is much socialization. Courts are now online, as are politicians. So is money. So is agriculture, and manufacturing, and shipping. The phone has indeed become the remote control for the world. Many previously offline devices, cars, doors, desks, weights, coffee makers, even toothbrushes, are coming online. Even pacemakers leave a digital trace. The physical still exists, of course. There are still physical human beings, there are still physical plots of land, there are still physical rivers and mountains. And for some law enforcement and military functions, a network state will need physical robots. But in a network state, everything physical is downstream of lines of code and enforced by cryptography, just as in a nation state. Everything physical is downstream of pieces of paper and enforced by the police and military. Assumption, the state becomes an admin dashboard. A second assumption is that once every interface is digital, it can be put online. And once online, in the absence of private keys, it can be centrally controlled. So, the network state system assumes that states like the USA and PRC will continue centralizing the power of their tech companies into one all-seeing dashboard, capable of surveilling, deplatforming, freezing, and sanctioning millions at once, or anyone at will. This digital power is currently exercised transnationally and without the consent of the governed. They have no true free choice of administrator. The network state system assumes that we can't fully put this genie back in the bottle, but we can constrain it. Specifically, we grant that every legitimate state will need such power to govern its subnetwork, for the same reason any centralized service needs a system administrator with root access. But we also build decentralized services that do not have any single system administrator, and tools for the physical and digital exit of citizens. Assumption, divide networks rather than land. Just as in the pre-Westphalian period, where the Catholic Church exerted transnational control. The digital power wielded by the American and Chinese empires invalidates traditional notions of sovereignty. The Peace of Westphalia equivalent is a network state system that limits the digital power of states solely to those who have opted in. Just as post-Westphalian nation-states were limited in control to people within their territory, post-Sartosian network states will be limited in control to people who've opted into their network. It is a division of the world by network rather than by land. Assumption, consent and cryptography constrain. So, in short, in the world of the network state, both states and citizens alike are powered up. Network states have a root dashboard with full access to every digital aspect of the network they govern. They also have security from outside interference because access to these dashboards is gated via private keys rather than passwords. However, this immense digital power is typically deployed non-violently, unlike with existing states, and constrained by cryptographic and physical exit, rather than by paper laws or toothless treaties. This is what powers up citizens, who freely choose whether to enter or exit, either collectively or individually. Thus, the legitimacy of a network state comes not from top-down declamations, but from bottom-up consent, as each netizen has opted in. A truly oppressive or incompetent network state loses them to exit, or doesn't gain citizens in the first place. And no state is strong enough to block the ultimate exit that cryptocurrency represents. The network state is a term. We can unpack the term network state in several useful and complementary ways. The network is the nation. The organic, voluntary, bottom-up nation that underpins the state is formed online in a network. This could be on the basis of language, culture, proposition, or some combination thereof. This represents a digital remedy to the phenomenon Putnam identified in bowling alone. In the year 2000, we were bowling alone, but by 2020 we were posting together. COVID-19 accelerated this process. People were spread apart in the physical world but packed together online. The network is the territory. VR isn't yet fully mature, but when it is, we'll identify the territory of a network state as a subnetwork of the open metaverse. We can understand this if we think about domain names, social profiles, and ENS names. Digital land can be created for free, but access to that land can become very valuable and, when deplatforming is in the cards, very contentious. The analogy to land goes very deep. To fully understand it, you need to understand graph layouts, but in short you can make maps of networks given any graph adjacency matrix. And if you use the distance metric of number of degrees of separation in a social network, that looks quite different from the map you get from a geographical distance matrix. The network is the state. How does a network state create and enforce laws? Digitally. It's Locke's justification of the state as the protector of private property, in the form of a digital registry. And its Lexic's code is law, but on-chain. Our entire antiquated process of adversarially writing high-stakes laws on paper at the last minute, deploying them in production to hundreds of millions of people without any testing, and then getting them interpreted in unpredictable ways by regulators and solicitors will be seen as a bizarre relic of an older time. Paper laws will go the way of powdered wigs. The network is the Leviathan. Here, we capitalize network as it's being used in the sense of God, state, network. The network here is a candidate for the most powerful force in the world. Where the Leviathan in the Hobbesian sense is not divinity, God, or military, the state, but community and cryptography, network. From this viewpoint, the network state can be seen as a fusion of Leviathans, like the God-state combination of the mid-century USA. Where the Marines fought for God and country, and where Americans pledged allegiance to the flag under God. So, in a network state, the network is the live's national network. The land, metaverse subnet, the law, governance network, and the Leviathan, Bitcoin network, all packed into one. It's the people, the digital territory they occupy, the rules that bind them, and the power that enforces those laws. Micronetworks and multi-networks. We noted earlier that a micronation is really a microstate, and many nation-states are actually multinational empires. These concepts generalize to networks. We can think of a micronetwork as a startup that intends to build a social network, but has zero users. So a micronetwork is like a micronation that plants a flag, but has zero citizens. Similarly, a multi-network like Facebook is a billion-person scale social network with many subnetworks under one company, just like the multinational Roman Empire, where many different groups were ruled by one state. Perhaps there's a reason Zuck admires Augustus. But the analogy breaks down in an important way. Startups create networks, but nations create states in a micronetwork, aka a startup. The startup creates the network that it ends up managing, both in the sense of the people in that network and the digital domain itself. Zuck came first, then registered the Facebook.com, only then came the users. But in a real nation, the people and their physical domain precede the state. For example, the Japanese people and islands predate the current Japanese government. That's one way people went wrong with micronations. You can't just treat them like a normal startup where you start with one person and build an impersonal product. The prospective network state founder needs to think about nation building from day one. That's not just community building on steroids. Ideally, that nation building process is really nation discovery. In other words, there's an existing community out there with an unexpressed national identity at the top of their identity stack, and they want to crowdfund territory and build the decentralized Zion. The network state is then just a catalyst for this. Startups create networks, but startups aren't states, of course. People have also gone wrong with the startup to state analogy in a different way. By thinking startups could act just like states without a legitimating process. Suppose we try the analogy that state is to a startup as nation is to network. That is, just as a state manages a nation and sets its laws. A startup like early Facebook or Twitter manages a social network and sets its policy. This worked, until it didn't. Facebook and Twitter have succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, yet they weren't set up to be governments. People didn't consciously sign a social contract to be governed by them. Facebook and Twitter grew to take over much of people's lives, but have no concept of digital property rights. Seizures and silencing weren't part of the bargain. Startups create centralized networks, but chains create decentralized networks. There are at least two ways to add genuine choice, and hence legitimacy, to centralized networks. Free the back end. On a free spot of land, you can have a nation without a governing state. Similarly, if we had a free region of the cloud, we could have a network without a governing startup. That's what Satoshi did. He reopened the frontier, gave us a cloud without corporations. He showed us how to create digital networks without any single centralized authority. One extension of that gives us decentralized social networks, the basis for an open metaverse. So that's one way to solve the problem: build digital land that isn't controlled by any single startup. Anyone on that land could then freely choose between governance networks. Free the login. The other, related way out is to retrofit an existing centralized social network to enable Web3 login, such that users can contact each other outside the service and their usernames are not locked into the system. Note that this is far more substantive than merely allowing users to export their data. It's more like the capability to message your followers without Facebook or Twitter's permission. Only decentralized networks can give rise to network states without one or ideally both of these features: decentralized backend and decentralized login. A micronetwork might grow into a multi-network. Just like zero-person Facebook became 3 billion-person Facebook, but it wouldn't have the legitimation of exit that enables a true network state. The millions of people on current platforms, and future ones, must be given the option to leave 165 with all the digital valuables in order for their state to be considered uncoerced. Zero network, one network, N networks. We know that multinational empires tend to have the same failure modes as micronations. The state doesn't actually represent a single distinct people, and thus fails on that basis. Towards that end, it's worth taking the overloaded term of social networks, and disaggregating it into zero networks, one networks, and N networks, just as we did for micronations, nation-states, and multinational empires. Here's a concrete example. Zero network, Facebook at inception, one-person founder, no users, one network, Facebook at Harvard, 1 month after founding. N network, Facebook today. 3+ billion users. And here's the underlying definitions that inform that example. Zero network, an aspirational social network startup with no users. One network, a coherent community. N network, a massive global network of networks. In more detail, a zero network is a startup with aspirations for creating a large social network, messaging app, two-sided marketplace, crypto exchange, or other digital watering hole where people interact. Note that not every online service fits this definition. Some apps like Mathematica or Photoshop are pure utilities. 166. An N network is the equivalent of a multinational empire. It's not a good base for a network state, for the simple reason that it doesn't represent a single nation, a set of coherent people. For example, the 300M users of Twitter or the 3B plus users of Facebook are unified by nothing more than a desire for likes. Of course, some of the subnetworks of an N network may have enough asabiya to form a network state. A1 network is the basis for a network state, something like a focused subreddit, a moderated Facebook group, a PHP BB forum, a large Telegram channel, or the following of a single Twitter influencer. Of course, not all subreddits would be one networks, but r/Keto with its intense dietary culture is much closer than a global forum like r/World News. A1 network typically has some basic form of moderation, a moderator can ban you, an influencer can block you, some community norms, and mechanisms for enforcement. It doesn't have all the criteria of a nation, the shared language, customs, history, and culture, but it's like a proto-nation. The following of a single large YouTube or Twitter influencer is probably the best kind of one network out there, in the sense of a proto-nation for a network state. Because it has shared context and history, as well as pointers towards a leader who can act as a dispute resolver. What is a national network? We now have a few definitions in hand. The properties of a nation. The idea of a network state as a combination of a national network, the people, and a governance network, the state, and the just introduced concept of a one network as a proto-nation. An embryonic version of the national network that underpins a network state. We also earlier noted that the definition of a nation was a bit fuzzy, both in the dictionary sense and according to different thinkers. With those preliminaries, we can now give a computational answer to the question of what is a nation. A verbal description. You can redefine a traditional nation as a densely connected subgraph in a social network, based on some metric such as linguistic distance, genomic distance, ideological distance, or cryptocurrency holdings. The nodes of a bona fide nation should group more tightly with each other than they do with other networks. In mathematical terms, nations are highly connected subgraphs of a global network according to one or more network distance metrics, like geographic distance, great circle distance on surface of Earth, network distance, degrees of separation in a social network, genetic distance, e.g., FST, fixation index, or another measure, linguistic distance, e.g., lexico-statistical measures, economic distance, e.g., 1, cosine similarity, ideological distance. Degree of similarity in belief as expressed by spatial theory of voting. The advantage of this definition is that while it's still fuzzy, how connected exactly does the subgraph have to be? It's now amenable to quantitative analysis. Given a network, a set of distance metrics, and some parameter choices, the subgraphs pop out. By this definition, a real nation would have more in-group than out-group connections, more domestic than international calls. A computational approach. Here's how you'd actually do that computation. Begin with any large N network like Twitter with k equals 300M users and N postulated subnetworks. Calculate any or all of the following distance metrics between individuals, if you have available data, using the definitions from the preceding section. dp, geographic distance, dn, network distance, dg, genetic distance, dl, linguistic distance, economic distance, ideological distance. Suppose we have 6 such metrics. Calculate them on k people, to form a k times 6 tensor of distances. Also collect a training set of labeled edges, where 2 people are marked as being part of the same one network or not, designated by y equals 1. For example, You might put two English-speaking Bitcoin holders who own guns, subscribe to our keto, and follow each other on Twitter in the same one network. Now use any machine learning technique to estimate y equals 1d 1.6. Something like naive Bayes can work, or something more sophisticated. Finally, set a threshold of say y equals 1d 1.6 greater than 0.50. All the densely connected subgraphs that pop out of that process are the one networks. In other words, given a set of postulated measures of national similarity, a bit of training data, and a parameter choice, we can cluster a large network into subgraphs. Applied to continental-scale social networks like Facebook and Twitter, we'd be able to see different kinds of clusters pop out for different parameter choices, much like you do with the lasso. Assuming you could get access to a global dataset like Facebook or Twitter's network, or scrape it. You could turn all philosophical disputes about what a nation is into simply a set of parameter choices. That means a nation is a subnetwork in a global social graph. What does a network state look like on a map? The first thing is to specify which map we mean, a map of the physical world, or of the digital world. The physical map in physical space, a network state looks like an archipelago of interconnected enclaves. As the dashboard above shows, netizens crowdfund territory around the world, link those pieces together digitally, and then use technologies like Web3 logins and mixed reality to seamlessly link the online and offline. Each such node of the network state represents a group of digital citizens who have chosen to live together in the physical world. As shown in the dashboard, the network state's population, income, and real estate is summed over all netizens across all network nodes. As the state grows, these numbers can, over time, become comparable to the footprint of legacy nation-states, including the real estate footprint. So, a network state is a physically distributed state, a bit like Indonesia, but with its pieces of land separated by internet rather than ocean. The digital map in digital space, a network state looks like a densely connected subgraph of a large social network. In our terminology, it's a one network, not an N network. To gain some intuition for digital space, realize that it is very different from physical space. Dimensionality. You don't have just the two dimensions of latitude and longitude. In a complex social network, you might need n dimensions to properly represent the graph structure. Plasticity. Imagine one day, South Africa suddenly appeared near NYC, with a footbridge to connect the two. That's like Spotify doing a deal with Uber. Suddenly, two huge networks get bridged and people can start walking across. This will become much more obvious as metaverse subnetworks are connected and disconnected by management on the basis of diplomatic relations between network states. Speed. Take a look at the full global footprint of the British Empire at its zenith, and now realize that Facebook achieved greater global penetration than that in just a few years. Elasticity. It's hard to create more land. Dubai has done some work in the area, and cruise ships arguably count, but it's easy to create more digital land. Albeit hard to make it valuable. The value of land is based on location, 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 but for digital real estate it's connection, connection, connection. Invisibility. We take for granted that we can see the Franco-German border, that we know who is on either side. But no one can really see the Facebook, Twitter border, the set of users that have accounts on both services but use them both for roughly 50% of their time online. Borders between nation-states are by default highly visible, borders between networks are by default invisible. This last point is truly deep. We're going back to terra incognita, to terra nullis, to the time of secret societies. To the time of, here be dragons. The open web is already dark to all but Google, the social web is already dark to all but Facebook and Twitter al. And while the third web will have some parts that are globally transparent, much of it will be intentionally private and encrypted. This is not a bad thing. In many ways, what we did over the last few decades was upload the entire world in unencrypted form online. Never before has it been possible for so many to stalk anyone. The re-encryption of the world has started with a tactical retreat from public social networks towards signal groups, but it will go much further. We may have hit peak map. Cartography becomes harder in a digital space that's darker and more dynamic than the well-lit physical world. Continents, once discovered, don't tend to move on you, but the internet brings us back to the time of Pangaea. Millions of nodes can disconnect and reconnect elsewhere all at once should they see fit, and new supercontinents of 100M plus connected users like TikTok can just arise out of nowhere. In short, our intuitions for digital space are just completely different from physical space. We'll return to this topic, but recognize that it really is a fundamental difference. While the nation-state is based on a deterministic physical division of land into states, the network state is based on probabilistic digital division of people into subnetworks. Example, physically proximal, digitally divergent. Take a look at this tweet. It shows that in physical space, the red and blue areas of the United States are cheek by jowl, but in digital space they are wholly disjoint. Thus, the US is not really a nation-state. It's at least a binational state, what we'd call a two-network, with two strongly connected subgraphs at each other's throats. These two nations are packed into the same physical environment, but are far apart mentally. A network state makes the opposite trade-off. It's a group of people spread out in physical space, but highly aligned in digital space. It's a one network, not an N network. How is a network state founded? We just talked about the need for a one network to be the basis of a network state, unlike an N network. A one network is a focused, moderated community like Ethereum research, while an N network is something like Facebook in the early 2020s. With N communities under its multi-billion person banner, where N is very large. But there's another constraint for network state creation beside the one network, and that's the constraint of reality. Saying, I'm founding a network state, is a little like saying, I'm founding a billion-dollar public company. It's not an impossible goal 167, but it's difficult. And we want to avoid terminological dilution and encourage realistic ambition. If we think about the startup community, we have a few definitions that allow us to talk about stages. We have startup companies and tech companies. We have seed, VC, and growth investors. We have bootstrapped companies and we have venture-backed companies. We have early-stage vehicles, billion-dollar unicorns, and trillion-dollar tech giants. Along the same lines, let's introduce a few definitions that help us establish the path to the network state. As umbrella terms, we'll use the concepts of startup societies and parallel societies, which are roughly analogous to startups and tech companies respectively. Like a startup, and unlike a small business, a startup society is a small group with ambitions of doing big things. Like a tech company, and unlike a legacy entity. A parallel society is a small to large group of people with at least one proposed major innovation relative to how things were done before. As sequential terms, we'll talk about network unions, network archipelagos, and network states. These are roughly analogous to seed, Series B, and public companies respectively in terms of how much effort it takes to build them. A network union is fully digital but is a real organization with money and a purpose. Like a seed startup that no longer merely exists on paper but has daily to-dos and folks doing things. A network archipelago has built up enough money to crowdfund physical territory, like a Series B company that has earned enough money to be taken more seriously. And a network state has achieved diplomatic recognition from at least one legacy state, like a public company that has jumped through all the necessary hoops to be recognized by the Nasdaq. Those are rough definitions. Let's get a bit more precise. Startup societies. You're founding a startup society, not a network state. A startup society is a new community built internet first, usually for the purpose of solving a specific social problem in an opt-in way. The implication is that this society is still pretty small in population. A parallel society is roughly equivalent to a startup society, but can be much larger in scale. This is an umbrella term for a network union, network archipelago, or network state. And now we have a way to talk about origins in a realistic way. You're founding a startup society. You begin as a network union, maybe crowdfund territory to become a network archipelago, and could someday grow into a network state. All of these are types of parallel societies. This communicates the point that there are different paths to a network state, and different, and completely valid, intermediate endpoints, just like you can run a small business, a lifestyle business. Do a merger, acquisition, or found a mere unicorn rather than going public and achieving $1 trillion valuation in the public markets. I'd roughly calibrate the difficulty of founding a 1M person network state that achieves diplomatic recognition from at least one city, state, or country at about the level of founding a 10M person social network or a billion-dollar company. Why? Because small countries like Tuvalu, El Salvador, and the like have already signed business development deals with startups, so it's no longer unheard of, just difficult. However, even if your ultimate goal is a unicorn, you don't start out by saying, I'm founding a unicorn. You say you're founding a startup. By analogy, what do you say, rather than, I'm founding a network state? The closest thing out there was once, I'm starting a decentralized autonomous organization, a DAO. That's better than, I'm starting a social network, because a DAO at least has an implicit concept of national identity, in the form of common coin holding. A social network does not have this, because most social networks, by dint of being social utilities, fly past one networks and become N networks if they are successful. However, DAOs also are bedeviled by the downsides of markets and politics respectively, fly-by-night speculators and bureaucratic boondoggles abound. So, if you want to eventually build a network state, you should instead start by saying, I'm founding a startup society. Parallel societies. We also use the term parallel society. This is roughly equivalent to a startup society, but can be much larger in scale. It's an umbrella term for a network union, network archipelago, or network state. It emphasizes that you have a possibly huge society running in parallel to legacy society, with at least one big piece that is wildly different from the existing world. We discussed parallel societies in Chapter 2. The network union. A network union is a social graph organized in a tree-like structure with a leader, a purpose, a crypto-based financial and messaging system, and a daily call to action. It's the underpinning of the new nation behind a network state. It forms dense peer-to-peer connections, not simply leader to follower. And it acclimatizes its members to working together as a society towards a common purpose. That purpose makes it different from a social network like Twitter, a subreddit, or even a DAO. The purpose isn't to waste time, or aimlessly speculate on a token. It's to advance the collective interests of its members through daily actions, organized by a network union leader. That common purpose creates a culture, and gradually turns a group of people into a network with national consciousness, into the foundation of a network state. Think about it, if people won't even show up to vote online, they don't care about the community. Conversely, if they've managed to do great things together as part of a network union, they'll be able to do more. And that is in fact Renan's definition of a nation. To have done great things together, to want to do more, such are the essential conditions to form a people. Man is not a slave to his race, or his tongue, or his religion. See also this earlier piece on network unions, before we tightened up some of the definitions. Public displays of alignment. A network union doesn't just do private actions for the collective benefit of its members. It also does public actions which show the world at large how organized, aligned, self-sacrificing, and mutually cooperating the members of the network union are. Call these public displays of alignment, a decorous riff on the American concept of PDA. As motivation, think about the many movies that center the tango in a campy yet serious way. Dramatic music plays as man and woman lock eyes across the room before beginning a series of complicated pirouettes. The dance floor clears a circle as everyone pauses to watch. The whole room is now paying rapt attention to this couple, even if they didn't know them before. That's an example of positive sum attention, because these two paid attention to each other in a public and synchronized way, others paid respectful attention to them. That couple must love each other very much, or at least must practice very much, and their coordination demands admiration. Even the onlooker who doesn't much care for dancing must give a grudging nod. Other examples of positive sum attention like this include orchestras, parades, the good kind of flash mobs, basketball games, and the types of gymnastic enterprises common to college football halftime shows wherein cheerleaders form tall human pyramids that require complete trust in the people at the base. All of these are examples of public multi-party coordination where people are creating art together in a high-trust society. The coordination is pleasing to the eye, but it also indicates to the audience that the people involved have practiced before, that they're aligned, that they aren't all playing whatever notes they want at whatever time, that there is some pre-arranged give and take. Public displays of positive sum attention show that two or more people can work together as a team. The opposite also exists, negative sum attention. When two people who are supposed to be aligned fight in public, when a corporation like the Washington Post melts down on Twitter, or when a whole country broadcasts its endless internal conflict to the globe each day, bystanders have a different reaction. It's not one of admiration and respect for the tight coordination. It's the opposite. The conflict causes a diminution of status for all parties involved. The phrase team of rivals draws our attention because rivals can't really make up a team. An organization characterized by public infighting isn't an organization, it's an occasion for popcorn or pity. 2 notes before we move to the main point. First, the kind of public conflict seen in a hard-fought NBA game or an Oxford-style debate is different, because a viewer could come away with respect for both winner and loser. Why? That kind of conflict is between clearly delineated parties, within certain rules that both entertain and constrain. It's ritualized conflict, it's expected. The loser often gets paid for showing up. So it's not a lose-lose fight, not a cartoonish bar brawl. Second, it's impossible to run any organization of sufficient scale without some degree of internal misalignment. You don't get to 500 million friends without making a few enemies. There's always someone with hard feelings, the envious, the disgruntled, the fired. They might start a fight to gain what they could not by other means. The consequent loss of status that accompanies a public fight is like the loss of money that accompanies a bad earnings report. It's not desirable, but it's absolutely survivable. To make up for the loss of money, you work harder next time. But to make up for the loss of status, you take a beat and figure out how to reunify your organization and show a united front to the world. In a phrase, you need some PDA, a public display of alignment. Politicians do public displays of alignment all the time. They trash each other during the primaries and then raise each other's hands in the general election. They're putting their differences behind them to build a united front. Countries do this too. That's what peace treaties, mutual defense pacts, joint military exercises, and international organizations are all about. The visual of flags flying together shows others that they're one unit. And that brings us to the concept of public displays of alignment for a network union. It's important to start by organizing the network union to do private tasks that the group as a whole benefits from. But eventually you want to show the external world that your network union can do impressive public things as a group. So, what's the digital version of a parade, or of a group singing in unison like the Estonian singing revolution? It might be something like a crypto Wikipedia, or some kind of collectively authored art in virtual reality, perhaps like Minecraft or Reddit's art place. It may need to involve proof of humans so onlookers know that this piece of digital art involved real people. But whatever it is, public displays of alignment are a way for a network union to not just quietly deliver value for its members, as it should, but to also publicly demonstrate to the world that it's a tightly coordinated unit, and worthy of being treated as such. Proving to the world that your network union can coordinate like an organic nation is a first step in the long process towards eventual diplomatic recognition. The new tokenomics is nation formation in the 2000s. Most technologists didn't care that much about how national currencies were run. The parameter choices of a currency were things only central bankers cared about. What's the interest rate? Is it a deflationary, inflationary, or even demurrage currency? Which actors have root access to the system and under what circumstances can they be deplatformed? And so on. But all those details and more became important for people founding new currencies. Thus, the concept known as tokenomics arose, setting up the financial and social incentives of a new crypto-economic community in a user and organization-aligned way. Similarly, all previously obscure details of how nations and states formed are newly relevant to network union founders. There's an idea maze for nation formation just as there is for crypto-economics. The first question any network union founder needs to be able to answer is, what is your nation formation strategy? Path to the network state. We can now define a path to the network state. Network union. A wholly digital entity, organized in a social tree structure, that engages in collective action on behalf of its members. The collective action is key for building organizational muscle. Network archipelago. A network union that begins acquiring and networking properties in the physical world. The physical interaction is key for building trust. Network state. A network archipelago that gains diplomatic recognition from at least one legacy state. The diplomatic recognition is key for attaining sovereignty. Of course, the delineation between these categories is fuzzy. For example, a network archipelago with 100k plus people, billions in annual collective income, and a large physical footprint around the world could be deemed a shadow network state. It would have more organization than most stateless nations, as it would actually have a state and land, just not all in one place. All it would lack is recognition. Slight fuzziness notwithstanding, this is a realistic path from a single network union founder to something big. The bootstrap recognizer. We call the first government to recognize a network state a bootstrap recognizer, named after the computer science concept of a bootstrap system that boots up another. The bootstrap recognizer is to a network state what El Salvador was to Bitcoin. The formal acceptance of the new system by the old to form something stronger than either of them individually. Each network archipelago that wants to become a network state should have a thesis on who its bootstrap recognizer is. It will likely be an existing state with many binationals that have formal legal citizenship with their existing nation state but have mentally migrated to become dual citizens of their new network state. The historical analog is those who identified as Israelis or Indians even before their states became formally independent. Note that while a bootstrap recognizer will initially have to be a nation-state, once there are many network states of significant scale. Network states could bootstrap the recognition of other network states. Digital civil society network unions, network societies, and other forms of digital civil society are valuable endpoints in themselves. For example, a serious open source project could have an associated network union that advances the collective interest of, say, a guild of React.js programmers, without any need to buy land. Or a fitness influencer could turn their online community into a network archipelago, replete with gyms around the world, organizing people to get discounted keto-friendly food. You can probably come up with other kinds of structures. The overall idea is to build digital civil society, all those community organizations that aren't either the state above or the isolated individual below. The kind of non-political voluntary associations that once built America, according to Tocqueville. I do not wish to speak of those political associations. Here it is a question only of the associations that are formed in civil life and which have an object that is in no way political. Americans of all ages, all conditions, all minds constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which all take part, but they also have 1,000 other kinds, religious, moral, grave, futile, very general and very particular. Immense and very small, Americans use associations to give fates, to found seminaries, to build inns, to raise churches, to distribute books, to send missionaries to the Antipodes. In this manner they create hospitals, prisons, schools. Finally, if it is a question of bringing to light a truth or developing a sentiment with the support of a great example, they associate. Everywhere that, at the head of a new undertaking, you see the government in France and a great lord in England. Count on it that you will perceive an association in the United States. These had vanished by the year 2000, according to Putnam. Putnam draws on evidence including nearly 500,000 interviews over the last quarter-century to show that we sign fewer petitions, belong to fewer organizations that meet, know our neighbors less, meet with friends less frequently, and even socialize with our families less often. We're even bowling alone. The network union and network archipelago are ends in themselves. They give us a roadmap for rebuilding digital civil society, to start doing things together with purpose and substance online. To move away from the distracting entropy of social media and the news towards communities of conscious intent. And from these network unions and network societies, we will form network states. Recognize why we need recognition. We just described why network states need more than community, and even more than economic alignment. They need a sense of national consciousness, of collective purpose, as provided by a network union. Now let's discuss why we need recognition. A fun one-liner is that crypto made progressives more libertarian and libertarians more progressive. Progressives discovered that you can build stateless money. Libertarians discovered that you then need to rebuild something much like a state: identity, reputation, anti-fraud, custody, trust, community, and the like. We think network states will have a similar dynamic. If they work, they'll show progressives a different path to political innovation. Rather than grinding through a thankless legacy system, they can use their organizing skills to help start a new one. But libertarian founders of network unions will similarly need to take a page from the progressive playbook. While libertarians are drawn to network states for the same reason they're interested in competitive government, seasteading, and micronations, libertarian literature underemphasizes the necessity of diplomatic recognition. Diplomatic recognition is as essential to a network state as exchange listing and wallet support is to a cryptocurrency. There are technical aspects to money, but it is also an inherently social phenomenon. Contrast this to an airplane, which will fly regardless of what anyone thinks. Similarly, while a network union can get started with one person, and even buy land and become a network archipelago, to cross the chasm it needs a plan for gaining diplomatic recognition. To go from unpopular but feasible to popular and important. Lack of recognition limits sovereignty. In a sense, diplomatic recognition is a partial, non-binding, but still meaningful commitment from a legacy state to respect the internal sovereignty of the new network state. To admit it to the family of nations, to open up a number of different avenues for trade and institutional innovation. Getting there means the founders of a network union that wants to become a network state can't be misanthropic, or even isolationist in mentality. A live and let live mentality won't be enough, you'll need to recruit people who win and help win. Because unlike an empire, the end goal of a network state is not world domination, it's world recognition. Why would we found a network state? But why? Why do we need the ability to found a network state? Why can't we reform one of the perfectly good countries on the planet? First, these countries are not perfectly good. Just as it was easier to start a new digital currency than to reform the Fed, it may be easier to start a new country than to reform yours. Second, we want new countries for the same reason we want blank sheets of paper, fresh plots of land, or new startups, to begin anew without baggage from the old. And third, for certain kinds of technologies, particularly transformative biotech like life extension, we need new jurisdictions with fundamentally different levels of risk tolerance. And clear-eyed consent by all who opt in. There's something in it for both engineers and activists, for both the technological innovator and the political progressive. Network states for the technological innovator. Why should technologists care about politics? The scientific innovation. Fred Ursum wrote that peaceful innovation in governance is more important for innovation than we realize. After all, the Catholic Church burned proponents of heliocentrism at the stake. It wouldn't have invented space shuttles. And the Soviet Union banned photocopiers. It wouldn't have allowed the internet. Today, we see that San Francisco is banning everything from scooters to straws, but what we don't see is what didn't even make it out of the garage. The physical world. The state controls the physical world. With sufficient consent, any law can be changed, and any regulation can be sunset, or reinvented. This is how bits unlock innovation in atoms. We form opt-in communities online to unlock innovation offline. The economics. Money isn't everything, but it's crucial to making something sustainable. We know that antiquated taxi regulations held back $100 billion in the form of Uber, Lyft, Grab, Didi. That financial regulations held back $1 trillion in the form of Bitcoin, Ethereum. And communism held back the Chinese people to the tune of $10 trillion, namely the entire Chinese economy. The data. Technologists can think of new opt-in states as experiments. Just as the ability to start new currencies moved us from observational to empirical macroeconomics, the ability to start new countries takes us from the realm of political science. The study of what is, to political technology, the engineering of what can be. The platform. We can think of the state as our most important platform, more important even than Apple or Amazon, the place where much of our data and lives are hosted. Right now, we can't upgrade the state. What if we could? The ethics. Just as many kinds of things become easier to build in the presence of a cooperative centralized server, many more things become easier in the presence of a cooperative centralized state. A network state builds a society where everyone has broad support for technological innovation. You want a country where people cheer mission control, not boo Musk and Bezos, and now we can build one. Of course, network states aren't for every technologist. If you care mainly about compilers or programming languages, you can get by under the current dispensation. And if all you want is a steady paycheck at big tech, a network state is not for you. But if you care about accelerating innovation in the physical world, we finally have an answer. Network states for the political progressive. Why should political progressives want to start new cities and countries? If you're a young politician, perhaps you don't want to wait till you're 70 years old to pay your dues and make your mark. If you're a community organizer, network unions give you a digital community to organize, sometimes against states and corporations, but also for the benefit of individual members, open source projects, businesses, and consulting gigs. If you're an advocate for a stateless nation like the Catalonians or the Kurds, network unions and eventually network states give a new path to recognition. If you're a policy wonk, network states allow you to run ethical experiments on policy, with opt-in participants that are as interested in governance innovation as you are. You can experiment with digital democracy, new forms of government, or anything you think interesting. If you're an idealist, network states bring back the voluntary communes of the mid-1800s America, where people could opt in to build their own vision of utopia. If you're an anarchist, network unions offer a vision of horizontal collaboration in the absence of traditional governance and without coercion. If you're an urban planner, network societies allow you to build support and amass funding to crowdfund your vision of the good. In short, whether you want to experiment with reforms or entirely new forms of government, there's likely something in the concept of network unions, network societies, and network states that will suit you. Moreover, these structures are far more democratic than the coercive governance structures of the legacy system, because they're all opt-in. 100% of members of a network union or network state have chosen to be there, rather than 51% imposing their will on a reluctant 49%. Network states are models for 100% democracy, not merely 51% democracy. With that said, the concept of a network state isn't a panacea. Many political progressives will be attracted to existing governments for one very simple reason: they already exist, and already have socio-economic power. You don't need to build everything from scratch. But for the idealists and the ambitious who are excited about the possibility of doing exactly that, there's nothing more politically interesting than a new state. How does a network state expand and contract? Network states give a wholly new way for states to expand. They can grow peacefully in the digital world rather than violently in the physical world. The network state formation process can begin with a single founding influencer and scale to a million-person physical community. We can break out the underlying vectors of growth as follows. Demographically. Most obviously, a network state, or a predecessor entity like a network union or network archipelago, can grow its user base through recruitment and reproduction. For the latter, the growing state will need some policy to recognize the new family members as netizens, such as jus sanguinis. Geographically. As the citizenry of a network state grows, it can start crowdfunding more territory in the physical world. This is a peaceful mechanism for territorial expansion. Note that these purchases need not be from sovereign states, though they may ultimately be. Digitally. A complement to geographical growth is digital growth, more domain names, crypto usernames, and social media handles under ownership of netizens and the network state. Economically. The people of a network state will earn income and invest on-chain. Those numbers, or an aggregate thereof, can be made public to the world via crypto oracles, thereby showing cryptographically provable growth in GDP and net worth. Ideologically, because a network state is fundamentally a proposition nation, it's constantly evangelizing its beliefs. But unlike a traditional nation-state's soft power, which is not directly tied to immigration policy, here the evangelism is explicitly connected to recruiting. Technologically, why call this point out separately? Technological progress is a defining feature of a network state to an even greater degree than its nation-state predecessor. A network state understands that in the absence of innovation, its at-will citizens will leave for more advanced jurisdictions in the same way people left Blockbuster for Netflix. But because technological innovation is non-zero-sum, the relentless competitive pressure for mobile citizens means the network state system is positive-sum, which is very unlike the nation-state system's zero-sum struggle for territory. The network state system is not about the battle for borders, but for backlinks, in a generalized sense. Many of the things that states traditionally fought over can now be abstracted and turned into an economic game. This is a step forward, for the same reason that it was a huge advance whenever nations resorted to trade rather than conquest to gain access to each other's natural resources. What underpins the new dynamic of network states is the intrinsic lack of scarcity of digital territory, the return of unclaimed land and terra nullis, the reopened frontier. As we discuss later on, it was this frontier, this room for experimentation, that built America in the first place. Voice was important, but so was choice. Thus, just like a tech company or a social network, a network state provides a smooth path from a single person with a computer and no other resources to a million-person global network. Constant, non-violent growth is now possible, not by conquest or coercion, but through volition and innovation. What is not a network state? As with nation-states, it's useful to give examples that are adjacent to network states, but don't quite fit. First, we'll go over conceptually far-away examples, then, a number of structures that are much closer, which can become network unions, network societies, and network states. First, let's discuss some things that are actually quite far away from network states, but that are often discussed in the same breath. Each has some important similarities, a social network, a global physical footprint, but lacks a key dimension. Your startup. As discussed earlier, don't go around saying that you're starting a network state. Say that you're starting a network union, and build up a community that's capable of doing collective actions online. Then crowdfund territory and turn your online community into a network archipelago with physical presence. Finally, if all the stars align, gain diplomatic recognition and then declare your society a network state. I know this might seem a bit like the Marxist insistence on the difference between socialism and communism, but the counterpoint is that nations have acquired land and gained diplomatic recognition before. And we note that it's important when they do. They just haven't done it in quite this way, with this progression. That's why we want separate terms for network union, network archipelago, and network state. Twitter, the social network. Twitter is a babel of competing and hostile clans, many of whom don't speak the same language or, even more importantly, share the same values. In our terminology, it is very much an N network, not a one network. I'm not sure how many true national networks there are within Twitter. It'd depend on the parameters of our computational algorithm for national distillation. But for the US alone it's at least two, arguably much more. WeWork, the co-working space. WeWork's woes notwithstanding, they built a useful product. But it was more like a utility than a true community, more like a Starbucks than a small town. Think about it, in a co-working space, the couch might be leather and the coffee might be decent. But you don't leave your laptop out of sight because you don't know anyone there. You need to get a conference room to speak freely. You need to use a privacy screen. In general, it's not a high trust zone. That's not a true community. Google, the company. Google, the company, has a large global physical footprint and an even larger digital footprint, with millions of square meters and billions of users around the world. It also makes many digital governance decisions per day. But its users aren't a community, and they don't really think of Google as a legitimate government. Conversely, while its employees do call themselves Googlers, they think of their employer as a company rather than a country in embryo. And they aren't really at the stage where they want to work hard on building a new nation. Bitcoin, the crypto protocol. There are hundreds of millions of holders of Bitcoin worldwide, and the ideas of Satoshi are core to modern thinking on digital governance. Nevertheless, Bitcoin does only one thing: facilitate uncensorable transactions in Bitcoin. It can be thought of as a meta-government, because it constrains network and nation-states alike. But it is silent on the 1,000 other things that even a monarchist agrees a government should do. Moreover, while there is some commonality of feeling between Bitcoin holders, there are also strong differences. Maximalists are only a subset of the community. Overall, the similarity between Bitcoin holders is probably more at the level of English language speakers than, say, Japanese language speakers. They can understand each other, or at least understand each other's premises, but they don't all have the same vision of the good. In short, a digital currency is a prerequisite for a digital country, but they are not equivalent. Next, let's go through some things which are close to a network state. In the sense that they can be converted to an all-digital network union or a digital plus physical network archipelago, but are not quite there. A political party. A political party is close. It has a shared community, it has a sense of self and non-self, it has a vision for governance should it gain power, and so on. What it doesn't have is a shadow structure where it can administrate the lives of its members even when it is outside of the formal government. It also typically doesn't own property, or formally facilitate the mingling and migration of party members. But all that can be done 24/7 without needing to win the vote in a general election, and network unionization may become an interesting route for any minority party. A network of hacker houses. If all the people in this network know each other well enough to leave their laptop on a couch with the confidence that no one will steal it, then it's a high enough trust community to be a proto-network archipelago. It may need to layer on governance. Keto. A subreddit for diet, like Keto, has a community, a governance structure via moderators, and a shared purpose. Don't laugh, strict dietary rules have been important for religious practice for centuries, and they are an excellent shibboleth for group membership. To build a network union, the members of Keto would need some kind of collective action that members do together, like bulk purchases of keto food or reviews of keto books. To turn it into a network archipelago, they might need to start keto clubs and restaurants and link them together, network physical territory. Their vision might stop at a cohesive society, instead of an all-encompassing state. Their network archipelago might be part of a network state that rejected not just the USDA food pyramid, but also the US Fed pyramid schemes. An influencer or CEO's following. A popular content creator or CEO is a good candidate for pulling together a network union. There's alignment, there's an existing group, and there's leadership. But they'd need to figure out a purpose for their community, if an influencer, or a purpose beyond the merely commercial, if a CEO. That'll be easier for activists and technologists, and harder for entertainers and pure salesmen. DAOs and NFT communities. As noted earlier, these are also quite close to being network unions. But they need to ensure they have members who are there for the long-term cause rather than for the short-term pump. If so, they can start pulling together communities of purpose towards collective action. A city-state. This bears mentioning too. A city-state is not a network state. Why? Because a city-state is concentrated in one location, and can be invaded by a stronger power, while a network state is geographically decentralized and encrypted. It can't easily be physically invaded without going after all of its territories, many of which may be unlisted, or literal single-person apartments. Which would be a politically fraught multi-jurisdiction campaign. And it can't be digitally invaded without breaking the encryption that protects its constituent blockchain. So a network state can be thought of as a v3 of the state. That combines aspects of the scaled nation-states of the 20th century with the nimble city-states that preceded them. It has the potential massive scale and defensibility of a billion-person nation-state, while preserving the innovation and consent of a small opt-in community. It's similar to how Bitcoin combines aspects of gold, V1, with Fedwire, V2, to produce a V3 system. In short, you need a strong community to even have a chance of building a network state. Twitter at large is not it, Google Inc. is not it, Bitcoin is not it. These lack either a single self-conscious nation, a functional state, or both. A political party is closer. A very tight-knit NFT community or influencer, CEO following is even closer. To get on the path to network states, they would first build digital strength via the network union, then add physical territory via the network archipelago. And then gain diplomatic recognition in a true network state. What technological developments enable network states? Venture capitalists are fond of asking the "why now" question to entrepreneurs. Why now? Why can we contemplate founding network states today, and not 5 or 10 or 20 years ago? What's changed in the world? Well, a lot has changed. Here are some of the key enablers of the network state. The Internet is to the USA as the Americas were to the UK. Of course, the Internet enables the whole thing. But the manner in which it enables the network state is worth discussing. Think of the Internet as a cloud continent. A sort of digital Atlantis that came down from the heavens sometime around 1991 and has parked itself over the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Every day, everyone who spends, say, 8 hours online is doing the equivalent of flying up to this cloud from Menlo Park or Tokyo for business or pleasure. And then flying back down. While there, they see new things, meet new people, and sometimes fight them. So far, what we've described is much like the settling of the Americas from 1492 to 1890, but there are at least 2 key differences. First, of course, the cloud had no pre-existing people. Second, unlike the vast but finite soil of America, you can create new digital land ad infinitum in the cloud. As we discuss later on, that reopening of the frontier changes everything. It means that the Internet is to the USA as the Americas were to the UK, a wide open territory that ultimately gave birth to new states and ways of thinking. Bitcoin constrains legacy states. Bitcoin is the next most important prerequisite for the network state. As a government of governments, it guarantees the sovereignty of both the individual citizen and the network state itself. Neither can have their funds stolen by each other, or by a hostile third party. Bitcoin has also created new fortunes outside the fiat system, demonstrated that institutions as powerful as the Fed can be replaced in a few decades, and pioneered an entirely new way of designing web services in a decentralized manner. Web3 enables new chains, decentralized identities, and censorship-resistant communities. With Web3, we can set up a blockchain as the backbone of each network state. This is the community chain that the state-appointed leadership has root over, as a complement to a public chain like Bitcoin or Ethereum that serves as an external check and balance. We can create decentralized identities similar to ENS and SNS to serve as digital passports for the network state. Defining citizenship on the basis of single sign-on access to network state services. And we can allow not just censorship-resistant communication, but censorship-resistant communities, voluntary gatherings of people that can exist outside the interference or surveillance of legacy states. Remote and Starlink open up the map. The moment something is put on the internet, it becomes remote-friendly. And everything is going on the internet. Moreover, remote doesn't just mean around the corner, it means around the world. Starlink, and satellite broadband more generally, powers up remote further, by making huge swaths of the map newly economically feasible. Nothing now prevents a sufficiently motivated digital community from setting up their own Burning Man equivalent in the middle of nowhere, except this time for permanent habitation. And with an eye towards incorporating formal towns and cities. This complements our earlier point. Through the internet, we're reopening the frontier, and making previously godforsaken areas of the map much more attractive. Unlike past eras, you don't no longer need to be near a port or mine to build a city, you just need to be near an internet connection. Mobile makes us more mobile.